introducing the applications before us this morning. And on the wings of the tables to the right and left are the members who will be debating and ultimately deciding the applications. We're also joined today by our portfolio holder at the side of the room. There are other members, officers and members of the public who may well be joining us virtually through the Teams system. The meeting itself is being run as a hybrid meeting today. That means, in effect, we're here in the committee chamber, which is at Canal Side, North Petherton. The meeting is available via Teams, so members of the public and other councillors can take part virtually. However, only councillors who are present in the room are allowed to take part in the debate and ultimately vote on the applications before us. If you are joining us online, could I just remind you to keep your cameras and microphones turned off until we call you to put those on if you have registered to speak. The format of the meeting will be as per the agenda, and the copy of the officer presentations for those of us joining us online are available through the council's web pages. We'll take each application in turn. The officers will outline the application, then we'll have public speaking time for those who've registered, and then we'll come to the members to debate and ultimately decide the applications before us. During that debate, there will be a proposer and a seconder. Members will then vote on this proposal. However, only members who are present throughout the whole of that debate can take part in that vote. And once that vote has happened, we'll then announce clearly as to whether it has been granted, refused, deferred, or whatever the decision has been. So if we move on to the agenda itself for today, do we have any apologies for absence, please?
Thank you, Chairman. I've only received apologies from Councillor Parry.
Okay, thank you very much. Item 2 on the agenda is urgent business. I've not been advised that there is any urgent business that isn't already covered by our agenda today. Item 3 is public speaking time for members of the public. For those of you who have registered to speak, as I mentioned before, we'll take each application in turn. The officers will introduce the application. I'll then ask you to come forward to the speakers table if you're within the room, and if you're joining us online, we'll ask you to turn on your camera and microphone. You have 3 minutes to address the committee. For those of you, again, who are in the room, you'll see we have a clock at the front that counts the time down, so you can see how much time you've got left to go. For those who are joining us online, I will interrupt you when there's a minute of your time left to go, just to let you know that your time is running down. And then obviously, if I could ask all members of the public to try and stick within 3 minutes, would be most appreciated. Item 4 is declarations of interest. Are there any declarations in the council room today? We'll start with Councillor Betty.
Thank you, Chairman. Page 72, the application in Western Zoyland. It's in my ward, but I've taken no part in any consultation.
Thank you. Councillor Kingham.
Yes, Chairman, a standard one with the Drainage Board.
Yeah, if I could just ask anyone who's on the drainage boards, if you could just indicate, and we'll take us en masse if you've got a note of that. Okay. Any other declarations? Yes, Councillor Scott.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, on the first case, 02220021, I'm the ward member, but I have taken no part in any discussions on the on this one. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Richards.
52, I'm the ward member, but I've taken no part in any discussions.
Okay. I might actually need to take some advice at this point from our legal officer. On number 8, I notice now that we have Compton Bishop Parish Council are registered to speak. Compton Bishop falls within our ward. Should we declare the same interest that we've taken no part in discussions on this application?
But when you say it's your ward, is it a parish council? Are you? Sorry, when you say it's your ward, Councillor Fillmore, are you a member of the parish council or town council, but it's just in your ward?
Correct.
When it's just in the ward, is that not actually an interest? But I know members feel more comfortable declaring an interest because it's in their ward, but it's only if you're a member of the parish council within that ward or a member of the town council within that ward. As long as you haven't taken any part, you still register an interest, but you will still be able to debate and vote in the room.
I think,
However, we will accept your declarations because I know members do feel comfortable declaring that. Thank you.
okay, just for consistency, then I will declare that Compton Bishop is within in our patch, and I think that takes about to Councillor Grimes as well. Thank you. Right, for members of the public, it's important that you know if there's any background or detail that members have on an application. Where you've heard today a couple of declarations you've heard in relation to the drainage boards and also to do with town and parish councils, it's important that members aren't involved in the decision-making process at the town and parish level and at this level. So in effect, at this committee, we have a standing order which says you can either be involved at the town and parish or you can be involved at the district. You can't do both. So where you've heard the members declare today they've taken no part in that discussion, that's left them free to come to debate and vote on the applications today. And where you've seen members vote about the drainage board, because the drainage board are a consultee, again, members are declaring they've taken no part in the discussion at the drainage board before it's come to this meeting. So that keeps them able to be part of the decision making. If we move then on to item 5, which is the schedule of alleged contraventions, the report that's within the papers, but also members will have had the confidential list of all the applications. I would just remind members, this is an item for note. If you need to talk about the detail of those applications, you need to talk with that of both the case officers outside of this meeting. Any comments on the actual report itself? Councillor Kingham, did you want to comment on the report itself, but not the detail of any application?
That's correct, Chairman. Yes, there's a number of issues which I'm concerned with, but I'd like to speak with officers later.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, members, that moves us on to the next item on the agenda, item 6, which is the planning applications themselves. The first ones we have are on the page 8. We're within Axbridge, and I think, is it Mr. Titchener, you're introducing this?
Thank you, Chairman. So this is application, so it's land to the south of Holgate Way in Axbridge. It's an application for approval of reserve matters. So those reserve matters are appearance, landscaping, layout and scale. And that's for the erection of 53 dwellings, of which 30% would be affordable housing. The application is before the committee due to the objection of the Axbridge Town Council, Compton Bishop Parish Council, who are an adjoining parish, and the ward member. Okay, so this is just an aerial image just to locate the site. So this is the town of Axbridge here, and this is the application site on its south-western edge. Just zooming in a little bit more detail. So it's on the southern side, so it comprises these fields on the southern side of Holgate Way, and then there's this sort of narrow sort of Compton Lane just on its northern boundary. It comprises agricultural fields divided by existing hedgerows. The eastern boundary to the site borders the Axbridge and Wedmore Medical Practice, just located here. To the north, there is existing residential development on Holgate Way. There is a listed building just off shot just up here for context, and the conservation area, which sort of largely centres on the centre of the town and West Street, does sort of come in reasonably close proximity towards the edge of the site. The Mendip Hills area of outstanding natural beauty is also relatively close, being on the northern side of sort of the built form of Axbridge, and the land levels of the site are such that there's a sort of steady fall from sort of the northern parts, sort of gently down towards the southern boundary. And so this is the red line of the application, just showing the extent of the development proposed. There is an existing farm on the western side of the boundary, and the red line that's shown is that was determined by the outline, so the site already has outline planning permission, and the red line originally included this field here on the western boundary that was in closest proximity to that farm. So parts of the site were removed from the application, so the red line was amended because of an issue of potential odour from the adjoining chicken farm. So an assessment was done. It was determined that certain parts needed to be removed, and that's been reflected in the slightly unusual, perhaps looking layout of the red line we've got here. But it was determined by the evidence from the outline. So this is the boundary for the site that we have now, the application we have now in front of us. So just in terms of planning history for context, so as I stated, it does have outline planning permission for up to 53 dwellings, of which 30% were to be affordable dwellings. There were 2 approved points of vehicular access. So vehicle access was one of the reserve matters which was determined at outline stage. So those are 2 elements that were fixed through the outline. And then the remaining matters, layout, scale, appearance and landscaping, were all due to come in later, and they've come forward as part of this application. The outline permission also included provisions on matters covering ecology, surface and foul water, archaeology, highways, contaminated land, and the management of construction. It also had a condition requiring the scheme to come forward in accordance with an illustrative layout. So the scheme that we have in front of us as submitted is for those remaining reserve matters. It proposes 53 dwellings, of which 15 are to be affordable. That's to be a mix of rented and shared ownership. Public open space incorporating a local equipped area of play, a public car park on the eastern boundary, and surface water attenuation and areas of habitat provision. So, as I mentioned, the outline contained provisions that there was an illustrative master plan when the scheme needed to come forward in accordance with that. So the plan shown here is the illustrative master plan that was attached as a condition to the outline, saying that the reserve matters needed to come forward broadly in accordance with the layout that's set out here. So it included a central area of open green space, sort of bounding onto and sort of fronting onto the properties, some of the properties on Holgate Way, within which some of the play proposals for the site would be proposed. There was to be a public car park on the eastern boundary of the site. There would be blocks of housing either side of the sort of central green area, so a sort of block here, and then again along its southern boundary. Surface water attenuation was indicatively shown to be within the southern extent of the site, along with some of the green space, and there was to be areas of habitat retention and hedgerow retention. So certain hedgerows, such as this western one, to be retained. A lot of the southern hedgerows were to be retained as well. So this is the proposed site layout for the application as it's come forward now in detail. So it takes that illustrative layout with its large central area of open green space, which form the sort of central frontage to the site and keeps that front and centre. That area contains the locally equipped area of play and a large amount of new tree planting within part of the western part and some within the play provision. Residential development is then continued to be arranged around the edge of the green area in accordance with the outline. The car park is on the eastern boundary, slightly further to the south than was shown. So that's down here in this corner of the proposal. And then surface water attenuation ponds continue to be provided along the southern extent of the site. And then the habitat provision is as was shown previously, with hedgerows being retained on the southern boundaries and on the western boundaries. So we've considered that the layout does come forward in accordance with the illustrative plans that were set from the outline in terms of those parameters. In terms of detailed considerations, we've tried to secure an internal road layout which wasn't too rigid. Some of the internal road layout is to a degree fixed by easements associated with the Bristol water main, which runs along the site, which has sort of a no-build easement on it. So there are some deflections within the road layout, so that the road is not quite as straight all throughout. It's an entire length. Initial designs included a foul pumping station within the green open space, which is something that officers didn't consider would be sort of conducive to sort of the green aspect that was trying to be achieved here. And that's been relocated just to be sort of down here, just off of the main internal road, so much less prominent and therefore more acceptable, but still maintaining acceptable distances from nearby properties. And then we have the car park on the eastern side, broadly in the location that was shown before, with footpath connection back up to the main Holgate Way and connecting beyond. A note there were some comments about perhaps the car park should be provided within the more central green space. In our view, that would sort of undermine some of the qualities of the green space in terms of providing that sort of green buffer, and that had several functions. It was to provide a sort of more pleasant outlook for the existing properties on Holgate Way, and so just to soften some of the impact of the scheme as a whole when viewed from the Mendip Hills A and B. So overall, we consider that the car park along the eastern side is a more appropriate location for it. So in our view, broadly speaking, the layout does conform with that sort of illustrative master plan set from the outline stage and is acceptable in its own right. In terms of this plan, just shows some of the affordable housing provisions. So in terms of the housing mix, the scheme, as I stated, provides for 53 dwellings, of which 38 are to be market dwellings, 15 are to be affordable dwellings. There is an off-site financial contribution, which is secured through the Section 106 attached to the outline, which would bring it up to a policy compliant 30% provision, because 15 is just works out just like a percentage under. So that's a standard approach. And then in terms of the Town Council ward member and affordable housing team had originally expressed some concerns about the dwelling mix proposed within the scheme, which included 37 four-bedroom dwellings. The affordable housing team also had some other concerns about the location and dwelling types of affordable housing proposed within the application. Originally, when the application came forward, affordable housing was very much clustered into two distinct areas within the site. There was a sort of cluster up here and a cluster up here, and then almost sort of none anywhere else. So it wasn't considered that they were well integrated. So some changes have been made in response to those sort of bigger concerns. So the mix of dwellings has been amended, so to reduce the number of four-bed properties. Whilst they are still the most common size, they're now part of a sort of wider mix comprising overall 4 one-beds, 4 two-beds, 13 three-beds, 34 beds, and 2 5-beds. As stated, the location of the affordable housing, with those units indicated by the colours here, has been more widely distributed around the sites so as to be less clustered. Just to make them more evenly distributed. And so I understand, whilst the Town Council, I understand, have maintained some reservation about the mix, the affordable housing team have been consulted about the changes, and they consider that the layout and mix have overcome their concerns. Overall, we consider the amendments are considered to provide a range of dwelling types to meet need and market demand. In addition, 40% of the units will also meet enhanced building regulation standards to provide homes which are more accessible and adaptable to people in wheelchairs. And then just some photos of the site, because I just want to touch on design heritage and visual impact. So these images of the site, so sort of looking sort of from Holgate Way, so looking across sort of countryside beyond, you can just see there's just a gentle slope looking down to across towards the countryside. This top photograph looking back up towards the site, so showing the backdrop of the Mendip Hills with the existing dwellings on Holgate Way. Here, and this photo here just shows public right-of-way when looking back, which runs along sort of this part here, looking back towards Holgate Way there. The top photo here shows Holgate Way with residential development just on the edge of the photograph. And this photo here is taken as you just come into Holgate Way, looking down across the site. So Holgate Way sort of sweeps around to the left, and there's some existing housing here. And then the upper photograph shows some of the existing residential development on Holgate Way. So this is a small cul-de-sac that just comes off of it, sort of immediately opposite part of the site. And this photograph just shows some of the existing medical centre, just that will sit immediately adjoining. And then these are a couple of photographs just taken from Google, just to give an example of some of the local existing house types in the vicinity. So because Holgate Way is an existing post-war development in close proximity to the site. So the images I've shown just to highlight that the development in closest proximity is quite suburban in character. It doesn't necessarily pick up on some of these sort of traditional elements that you may associate with somewhere like Axbridge. If you go to places like the High Street and West Street, where some of the older properties are located, here we've got sort of much more more sort of 1960s, 1970s era properties and a range of materials, some render, some brick. very sensitive. So, hang on. So this is just an image of one of the street scenes to get a sense of some of the properties proposed. So this is an image of the street scene, which would sort of effectively be running the main street, which would be running through the site. There will, of course, be the large area of green in front of it, which isn't shown in the street scene, but it's just to give an indication of how this may look when viewed from Holgate Way. The applicant's been encouraged and sought to pick up on some of the aspects of the town that contribute towards its character, rather than taking its cues only from those dwellings which are immediately opposite. So the scheme delivers a range of house types that pick up on some of the traditional elements, including use of render, which we would consider to be the most predominantly used material in the town centre, rather than some of the brick, which is opposite, which is maybe not quite as traditional. So there is some occasional use of chimneys, as you can see from the street scene image. Other traditional features have been picked up as sort of simple sort of gable to gable roofs. Occasional use of chimneys and some low eaves heights, so the eaves just finishing just above the window line. So, I mean, some concern have been raised by the Town Council and some other respondees about some of the designs. I mean, amendments have been made to remove and or reduce in number some of the designs that were considered to be perhaps less appropriate. There was some concern about sort of properties with sort of a double gable front, so such as this, where you've got a double projecting gable. So there were quite a number more of those properties in the originally submitted scheme, and in much more prominent locations. So they've not been removed in their entirety. There is a few of them left, but they're in much less prominent positions. They don't make a significant contribution to the street scene. So we've tried to, the applicant has tried to maintain more traditional features in more prominent locations. And these just show a range of sort of different house types. So just in terms of sort of some of those detailing I meant, so render finishes is predominant, sort of simple gable to gable roofs. So some of these properties exhibit some of these features. There is the occasional property, I say, with a projecting gable, but they are sort of much lesser in number, and such as this one here. And so you just get a sense of the different types throughout. We also raised some concern about some limited use of reconstituted stone, for which we consider there to be little local example in Axbridge. So the applicant has changed that, so there are no properties with reconstituted stone now. What is going to be included is a small number of properties, so you see these ones with this darker sort of facing material, which will have blue lias natural stone. So that's just to pick up on the fact that there are some stone properties in Axbridge. It's not render is by far the most common if you go into the centre, but there are some stone properties, and this just picks up on that. And we feel that blue lias is the most readily available stone that would more closely match that use at the time. There's still a few properties with brick, but they're in much less prominent positions. They don't sort of feature widely in the street scene. Some of the rear properties will feature brick, and some elevations in much less prominent positions, perhaps towards the southern edge of the site, will feature some brick, but not to an extent that we would consider unacceptable. And then in terms of heritage impacts, as I mentioned, there is a Grade 2 listed building up here to the north, and the conservation area is located up there. So the conservation officer had raised some concern with the initial layout, which was considered to be too dense in this northwest corner. Where the affordable dwellings were initially proposed to be located. So there was originally to be sort of a terrace of affordable dwellings in this location, with its gable end sort of hard up to the boundary. So that terrace has been removed as part of the other changes that I mentioned to the affordable housing provision to more integrate them within the site. And the aim of that is to achieve a less dense form of development up here, so we didn't need to have quite as many properties, and it's also enabled the properties to be pulled off the boundary, and some screening provided along the full length of that boundary to provide some of the softening that the conservation officer was seeking. So as you can see here, we've got tree planting shown along these the boundary here. So we would consider that those changes would address those concerns, those specific concerns about the impact on the listed building in terms of softening, improving the impact on its setting. And we would consider overall, just in terms of broad design terms, that the scheme does provide a positive response to the character of the town. Then just come on to highways and parking. So as I stated, vehicle access to the site was approved at outline stage. So this included 2 vehicular points of access. These are as shown here. So this is a plan from the outline, so that effectively fixed where the 2 points of vehicle access were. I know that some comments from local residents had raised concerns about the loss of 2 existing trees on Holgate Way, but as the access plan shows, they were approved to be removed as part of the outline to ensure that there was appropriate visibility for the accesses. That's not something that we were able to revisit. I note that the Town Council wanted to see a separate vehicle access for the public car park sort of down here, and have raised concern that it could only be accessed via the internal road. But again, the vehicle accesses were fixed at the outline stage. And the illustrative master plan effectively showed that the car park would have had to be accessed internally with foot connections onto Holgate Way. So that's not necessarily something we feel can be revisited. The Highway Authority has commented on the reserve matter scheme. They provided detailed comments for the applicant on design matters which could affect things like future adoption and the subsequent Highway Section 38 processes which happen after planning. They have not raised any objection to the application as proposed. In terms of parking, the scheme provides a total of 172 parking spaces, and that's via a combination of on-plot parking and visitor spaces, and that includes the car park on the eastern boundary. It's noted that there has been some concern about the loss of on-street parking on Holgate Way through potential double yellow lining. So double yellow lines aren't something that's controlled through planning, that's through separate highway processes such as Section 278. Now, highways have confirmed there may be a need through the road safety audit for some double yellow lining on Holgate Way, but in terms of comments that the entirety of Holgate Way is to be a double yellow line, they've confirmed that is highly unlikely to be the case. The latest drawings from road safety audit show that there just needs to be some double yellow lining on displays of the accesses. And that's just on the southern side of Holgate Way as well. So on-street parking will remain in places along the road. Concerns have also been raised about potential highways impact from traffic generation on nearby junctions, including on the A38 and Cross Lane, so that's off some distance to the west of the site. Concerns have also been expressed about reductions in bus provision since the outline was granted. I mean, again, however, these are not matters that can be revisited at reserve matter stage. The only things that we can consider are those reserve matters, which is the layout of the scheme, the scale of the scheme, its appearance and its landscaping. Those are the matters in front of us. So the parking provision, as I noted there in the report, there is a small shortfall in provision. We would consider that, well, the highway standards are optimal and they're not obligatory. We haven't received any objections from the Highway Authority about the highway safety or parking implications of the scheme, and overall our view is that it is therefore acceptable in highway terms. I just want to touch on a few other matters before I just wrap up. So just on sustainability, there was some initial concern about a lack of sustainability measures included within the proposal. So amendments were sought, which were subsequently reconsulted on, and each plot now includes electric vehicle charging points and solar voltaic panels on each unit. In terms of play provision, the Parks Officer had originally considered the play provision to be basic and not adoptable. So in terms of the quality of the provision, so that's been amended. So there are now more features, additional slides, trampoline, etc. And the Parks Officer has welcomed those changes, including some of the changes to the material. So make it potentially more likely that they could be adopted by the council if need be. Though I understand the applicant will intend to transfer them to a management company. In terms of amenity considerations, all dwellings are suitably sized. They're sufficiently separated from existing dwellings and no other uses, so that we wouldn't consider there to be any amenity impacts that would arise. Drainage, statutory consultees are satisfied with the surface water and foul water drainage arrangements. Ecology was a matter that was considered outline, but a revised survey was submitted and provided, and consultees are satisfied that conditions at the outline remain acceptable and provide acceptable mitigation. The Rights of Way team are also satisfied that controls within the original Section 6 for some improvements to nearby rights of way are also satisfactory. and have no further comments. So overall, just to summarise, the principal development was established at outline stage. We have secured a number of amendments to address a number of concerns raised during the consultation period. We would consider the proposal conforms to the illustrative layout, which is a requirement of the outline. It provides for a high quality scheme, large areas of public green space, and dwelling and layout design appropriate to its context. So our recommendation is that permission should be granted. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just see we've got a number of speakers on this application, so we start with Chris Camp to start with. Good morning again. Just reminding you, you've got 3 minutes. You'll see the time on the clock and start whenever you're ready, please.
Okay. Good morning. I speak as a resident of Axbridge for some 43 years. This development, enabled by designating Axbridge as Zone 2 community on criteria that doesn't apply, was flawed from the outset. If problems are not to be further compounded, the committee should act on the concerns expressed by Axbridge Town Council before proceeding further. Parking. This development provides a unique opportunity to improve the situation for all residents and visitors to the town. The development requires 181 spaces, and on paper it has 179. However, 26 of those are designated public parking spaces, and their use by the existing Axbridge residents and visitors will ensure they will not be available for the estate residents. 39 of the spaces are included are garages. How many with access to a garage actually use it for a car? Garages are full of recycling containers, bicycles, or even converted for work from home offices. Real world parking on this site amounts to just 114 spaces. And the consequence of this is one you see throughout Axbridge. Residents will quickly concrete over the front gardens to create the additional parking they require, with the implications to water runoff and the estate aesthetics. These problems are a consequence of the much larger homes than those indicated on the original 106 agreement. The committee should consider if this is what you intended. Hallgate Way, concerns have repeatedly been expressed about the speed of traffic if yellow lines are applied. The response suggests that restrictions may only apply adjacent to the junctions, with some street parking remain inaccessible. If that's the case, why do the plans show parking bays? The response also suggests street parking on the northern side of the road. This has never had restrictions, but in the 37 years I have lived on Hallgate Way, I've never seen anyone park there. It's on a blind bend, and all drivers know instinctively it's dangerous. Or are we saying that following this development, dangerous parking is officially sanctioned? When last in front of this committee, when 106 was approved, a member said, and I quote, "They wouldn't build them if they couldn't sell them." And for many, that can appear to be the beginning, middle and end of the planning strategy. We deserve and expect better. Just because an item is not a reserve matter does not mean it doesn't matter. I ask the committee to hit the pause button on this development to allow the developer to respond fully and constructively to residents' concern, and require highways to engage and spell out exactly their intentions in regard to street parking, traffic calming and resident safety. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and well timed. Vicky Bryce, if you'd like to come forward. And just to confirm this morning, you're speaking on behalf of the Town Council. Excellent. Again, you'll see the time on the clock. Start when you're ready.
Okay. I am Vicky Bryce, Clerk for Axbridge Town Council. Thank you for the opportunity of addressing the committee on this important application. The Town Council's objections are set out fully in the report. Today we wish to emphasise the key points. As I'm sure you will be aware, Axbridge Town Council and our community as a whole were strongly opposed to the outline application. On receipt of the Reserve Matters application, the Town Council had a public meeting attended by around 50 members of the public. It was a very constructive meeting, considering the plans in detail and focusing on the reserve matters. Axbridge is a lovely medieval town, and the site is in a prominent gateway position into the town, abutting a conservation area and close to listed buildings. It's an ideal opportunity for both the developer and the community to provide a flagship site of high quality design, which is also sympathetic to the parking and traffic issues, whilst looking after the environment and wildlife. The Town Council welcomes some of the revisions to the original plans, particularly the layout of the affordable housing, changes to the design and materials, and the introduction of electric charging points and solar panels. The Town Council's ongoing main objection relates to the lack of parking provision and the associated impact on traffic. Parking is the main issue within the town. The planning application does not, by the applicant's own admission, meet the parking standards. Furthermore, the provision of the parking area at the outline stage was intended for public use. The application, however, includes these spaces as part of the visitor parking provision. The necessary introduction of yellow lining either side of both entrances will significantly reduce the current level of on-street parking. The siting of the car park area hidden within the site offers shared access does not make it easily accessible to the public. These combined issues actually result in a very significant shortfall of parking provided by the new development. The loss of on-street parking will also increase the speed of traffic along Holgate Way. These aspects are both highly detrimental to the community. The council is also concerned about the location of the play area being so close to the road. The two main issues of the Town Council could be addressed by exchanging the position of the car park and the play area. Whilst we appreciate the open space area to the front provides a landscaping buffer, we see no reason as to why the car park area could not still be landscaped to retain this buffer whilst providing a larger parking area easily accessible from Holgate Way. On an earlier plan, the play area was shown in a different location, I believe, close to the car park area. The council's preference would be to simply retain this as open space and use Section 106 monies to enhance the existing Town Council maintained play area. As it stands, the long-term management of both the play area and parking area is of concern. Finally, we appreciate that with the imminent change in local government, there must be a temptation to get things done. However, there is only one opportunity to get this right, and all efforts should be made to ensure it is a development to be proud of. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. And again, well timed. Elizabeth Parker, would you like to come forward? Good morning. Just confirm you're speaking on behalf of the Parish Council, Compton Bishop today.
Compton Bishop Parish Council.
Okay, start when you're ready. You'll see the time.
Thank you for this opportunity. I think in the sort of atmosphere of climate change and how we're being encouraged to get out of our cars and get to our destinations by foot or cycle. And Somerset is very good. It's really encouraging us to do this. So we have come here because there is this public footpath between Cross and Compton Bishop and Axbridge. But unfortunately, it's not available for people who've got children who want to use their buggies, or for invalid people who've got their vehicles. And we have got all these people in Cross. Well, Holgate Way lies at the west end of Axbridge, and the new development is very close to the footpath between Cross and Axbridge. And it's also the very busy Cross Lane, which is used by the quarry lorries and other large vehicles on this busy road. So the alternative is the footpath, the public footpath behind the hedge, which runs parallel to the road. And unfortunately, it is just a path in the field. And where there is the possibility of cattle attacks or obstruction on the pathway. And we have evidence of both these situations. And we do acknowledge that there is a flimsy wire running along the east end of the pathway. But last year, this was breached by the more adventurous young ones and watched closely by their protective mothers. If there could be a proper stock fence and gates, if they're needed, that let through pushchairs and invalid vehicles with a better surface, this would enable the people from Axbridge to access the very good pubs and walks in Cross, while the people of Cross could access the shops, pharmacy, post office, etc. The two parish councils and the town, Cross Compton Bishop Parish Council and Axbridge Town Council have over the years acknowledged the need for this sort of upgrade. And I do think that if this development goes ahead, there's going to be families with children and who will want to come to Compton Bishop and the AONB and the paths and the good pubs that we have there. And we know that the people of Compton Bishop do love to walk to Axbridge to access the shops, the post office, the doctors. So it just makes sense for there to be a proper footpath, public way to be able to walk safely. There are people that we know in the village who are nervous about using the footpath.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Councillor Godwin Pearson, would you like to come forward? Good morning. As you know, you've got 3 minutes. Start when you're ready, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for having me here today. I'm not going to cover the same ground as Vicky has or Elizabeth, but suffice to say, I'm in full agreement with the concerns of the Town Council and the Parish Council. I mean, look, fundamentally, if we're going to concrete over a field, we need to make sure that the development's pretty special and something to be proud of, don't we? Rather than something people will come to hate. In the process of creating Lavender Rise, we are removing carbon sequestration and displacing a great deal of wildlife. Sedgemoor has declared a climate emergency and an ecological emergency, but these are useless unless we take them into full account when we're building new housing estates. So what does this mean in practice? Well, creating the wildlife area at the bottom of the site now, then fencing it off to prevent damage, is what I would describe as a proactive approach to mitigating and adapting to climate change as per Section 14, Part 153 of the National Planning Policy Framework. It would also create a safe space to which small animals, birds, insects and reptiles can escape when the work proper starts. So let's build that first. In addition, 2 bat boxes and a single nest box don't even begin to address the ecological emergency on the site, so I'm requesting at least 4 bat boxes on mature trees and a swift box, nest box and bee brick on every building to set a precedent as we go into the new council. The cost of this is tiny, but the impact will be huge on the local wildlife. Secondly, Elizabeth has briefed you on the rutted footpath that runs along the inside of the hedgerow on Cross Lane. It's the only access for residents, particularly those with bicycles, pushchairs or wheelchairs, to get to Compton Bishop and Cross, to the nearest pub, to the A38, to bus routes. It's essential that people aren't taking their lives into their own hands when walking along there. Now, you might have heard that, outline planning covers this or should have covered this. That's when we were debating whether or not this should go ahead at all, not what the fine details are. Outline planning covered vehicular, not pedestrian access, and conditions 18 and 23 seem to indicate that some of this access can be covered in reserved matters. Planningportal.co.uk states that reserved matters covers accessibility for all routes to and within the site, as well as the way they link up to other roads and pathways outside. So I'd like to request as an exceptional request in reserved matters that Bellway Homes liaises with the councils, highways and landowners to fully fund and create a proper fenced footpath for residents of the new development and of Axbridge to get to Cross and back, with a footpath to the A38 and a 99-year lease. So more for the environment, more for nature, and better access, and all for a small amount of money compared to the profit that'll be made. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Perfectly timed. Thank you. Coral Curtis, would you like to come forward, please? Good morning. And again, just reminding you, you've got the 3 minutes. You'll see the time on the clock, so start when you're ready.
Good morning, Chair and committee members. My name is Coral Curtis. I'm a Chartered Town Planner and I'm pleased to be able to address this committee meeting this morning on behalf of the applicant Bellway Homes in support of this application. This seeks approval of reserved matters in connection with the development of 53 new homes, which has previously been granted outline planning consent by the council. Bellway Homes are very pleased that this application is being presented to you today with a recommendation for approval, as this reflects the culmination of a substantial process since they acquired this site and then submitted this reserved matters application in October 2022. In our view, the approach between us and the council has been collaborative and positive, the result being a development which we consider will integrate well with the existing community, as well as delivering well-planned, modern and energy-efficient homes. Bellway have sought to address the requirements of officers, town council, ward members and the public in order to achieve a high quality design scheme. We've amended the mix of housing to incorporate more 3-bedroom properties at the request of officers and the public, even though our market research has identified that since the pandemic, households are looking for larger properties to accommodate home working. We've addressed a key concern relating to heritage impact in the northwest corner of the site by pulling development away from the northern boundary, which has allowed us to implement a new hedgerow and trees to soften the built form. We've agreed to change materials to ensure that the predominant one would be render with key plots in blue lias stone. Some dwellings would still be proposed in brick, which ties in with existing development in Holgate Way, which we also didn't want to ignore completely, given that these homes are adjacent to the site. All dwellings will be provided with solar panels and electric vehicle charging points. We acknowledge that there is a minor deficiency of parking spaces against the planning requirements. However, we've increased this as far as possible without impacting the required ecological habitat, public open space or landscaping to be provided. Meeting the policy could result in a sea of parking to the front of individual properties, which we consider is inappropriate when we should be trying to discourage high levels of car ownership. To compensate, spacious home working areas have been provided, which will reduce the need to travel, which is a key aspiration of climate change policy. We have also amended the proposed play equipment and added new features, including an in-ground trampoline. Wood was originally chosen purely for aesthetic purposes, but the applicants have agreed to also change this to metal following the response from the Town Council. Bellway are an experienced provider of new homes and are committed to the successful delivery of this development. The approval of the detailed design elements before the committee today will not only represent a significant milestone in achieving this, but also contribute to meeting delivery commitments as part of the Council's overall housing land supply. We hope that you are able to endorse your officer's recommendation and grant approval subject to the conditions which have been identified. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I come to members, obviously there have been a number of raised points by the speakers. So if I could ask Mr. Titchener, I think we've had parking, the play area, public rights of way and the wildlife issues. If you'd like to just comment on those, and then we'll come to members for the debate. Thank you. Yeah, public right of way and the wildlife, including the timing of the wildlife area, I think was mentioned.
Yeah, so just in terms of the parking provision, I think that's been noted, and throughout the report that there is a shortfall, a small shortfall of parking provision compared with the standards that are set by the county parking strategy, and we recognise that. It's a relatively small shortfall. It does include the public car park in terms of the total number of spaces that are provided. I guess there's some synergy in terms of the usage that car park will have some usage during the daytime, when it will not be as widely used by residents and can perform a function locally, and but then also in terms of the evening times when it's more likely to be used by residents. So it will have a kind of dual use form. And notwithstanding the fact that there is some reduction in parking overall, we're mindful of that. But we've also have to be mindful of the fact that, as I stated, the parking standards are optimal. And that's something we've had to take account of before. And overall, whether we are delivering a good mix of other considerations on site is something that we have to take into account. The Highway Authority hasn't objected to the application. They haven't raised an issue with the shortfall parking provision. So we've just had to take a balanced view overall in terms of the quality of the scheme we think that is being put forward, that overall it is acceptable. I know some speakers had raised the issue about people don't use garages. The parking strategy takes into account garage spaces, and so we have to take into account them as a space, and it's not something that we could ignore. In terms of the play provision, I know there were some comments about the where it's located in the site. Someone said about whether it's in a safe location for sort of used by children. Now, it's in a central location where it can be easily accessed by all residents. our policies require play provision to be within 100 metres of all properties. So centrally locating play provision within the centre of the site makes good planning sense. It's also been reviewed in detail by Scott Mason, the Council's Parks and Open Space Officer, who's satisfied with the provision, hasn't raised any safety considerations either. So we would consider it to be the most appropriate location within the scheme. It's also more conducive to providing that sort of green buffer feature that is central to the illustrative layout as previously set out. In terms of the public rights of way issue, maybe it's worth me going to the plan, an aerial plan, so people can see exactly where we're talking, because not everyone will necessarily be familiar. I'm going to have to go up to a pretty high level. Right. So this is the application site here. We're talking, if I understand correctly, about an existing public right-of-way which runs along the southern side of Cross Lane. So it's outside the application site. It is, as I understand, existing public right-of-way you can get on with a gate here, and it sort of and then comes back out with a gate here. So I believe it's just it's not surfaced or anything at the present time. Now I understand the local concern about this, and I understand it's been an aspiration for a long time locally to deliver something in that location. I guess the difficulty here is that it's outside the application site. So I know the council referenced some conditions about provision of footpaths and things within little conditions on the outline. Those to do with the internal layout of the application site. This is a matter, if it was going to be provided, would need to be secured via Section 106 agreement, effectively off-site works or off-site financial contribution. Now, the Section 106 agreement has already been provided and signed, attached to the outline planning application attached to here. So notwithstanding the local concern, there isn't a mechanism now to secure it. What we're looking at is the reserve matters. I guess what there is the potential for is that a site like this will make quite substantial contributions in terms of community infrastructure levy. So it will pay to the council something like, I think it's over 600-something thousand pounds in community infrastructure levy, which will go to the council. Because Axbridge has a neighbourhood plan, they are entitled to 25% of that community infrastructure levy. So they are due to get, what would that be, at least 160,000, I'm guessing, of funds to spend as they see fit on local infrastructure. Now, the applicant had done, when this request very recently came up, just done some initial costings of what those works might come to, and they could come up to somewhere between sort of 15 and 20,000 pounds. They were sort of estimating. That's a very initial estimate. But actually, that has the potential to be quite readily covered by the seal contributions that the town council could receive. So I understand there's some concern that it should be provided by this, but there is still that mechanism for community infrastructure levy, which it could be provided. In terms of the wildlife provision and the protections there, so ecology was an outline matter. So there are conditions on the outline. So the outline was subject to a habitat regulations assessment, had to consider things like bats, and there were conditions that were applied, and they included things like construction environmental management plans. So that sets how habitat areas will be protected during the construction phases. So in terms of that concern about will those areas be protected during the construction phase, then those plans that have already been submitted as part of the discharge conditions and approved by the county ecologist set out how those areas will be protected so they're not affected by construction during the build-out periods. I know there was some comment about the low numbers of sort of bat boxes to be provided and bee bricks. I'm not aware that there's any bee bricks proposed. The county ecologist had signed off the detail. Just in terms of the bat boxes, though, the habitat regulation assessment did make some comments about they didn't want too many bat boxes because the habitat locally is used by certain bat species, and sometimes they don't want to introduce other bat species that might conflict with that. So they usually have to do the habitat regulations assessment in terms of greater and lesser horseshoe bats. So there's a rationale for maybe lower bat boxes. The bee bricks, I don't see a lot of provision for that. If members felt that was something that was needed to be added, then I guess there may be scope for additional condition on that. I hope that covers everything. If it hasn't, then please let me know.
Okay, thank you very much. Members, comments or questions, please? We'll start with Councillor Scott.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, this is a controversial site in Axbridge, but we are where we are. With regard to the Highway Authority, I understand that there were concerns they had, and at the beginning of February they said they were making further considerations, but I haven't actually seen those, and I just wondered if the officer could confirm what they would be. There is a big concern here because of the Holgate Way. Although it's a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit, recently a speed watch, people from Axbridge actually recorded speeds of 48 miles an hour, and regularly speeds of between 30 and 40 miles an hour along this stretch. Maybe some of that is caused by the on-street car parking, because there is quite a lot of on-street car parking on the left-hand side, which means that people have to hurry through if there's a car waiting at the far end. However, with the introduction of yellow lines along there, and maybe parking on the north side, which if there's no yellow lines, then it will obviously encourage people to do. As explained by one of the members, one of the audience earlier, it is a blind bend and it is dangerous. So you are actually provoking an issue where it could be dangerous there. So I'd really like to know what the plans are from the Highway Authority to improve the speed of traffic along there and to ensure that the 20-mile-an-hour speed limit is actually enforceable or adhered to, which raises then the question of having the play area right next to this very busy road. I share the concerns of the Town Council, although looking at it aesthetically, it probably would look quite nice to have a green area there with trees. But as the clerk, Vicky Bryce, has said, if there was car parking provision there, it could be landscaped and soften the blow of having cars parked there. So I'm not sure whether that's something could be renegotiated, because obviously having the children's area where the car parking provision is would be a safer place for the children. There are other few points. I mean, it's about the actual landscaping. As said, we've declared an ecological emergency. This is the first chance we can do something properly here or constructive. And I was just wondering why there isn't more planting on the western boundary, because two mature hedges have been removed, and they've been indicated as being very important for the foraging bats. So to actually include a good hedge along the western boundary, in addition to the one that's already retained, plus extra on the southern side, would be advantageous. I'm also concerned about the attenuation ponds. They seem to have been squashed down a bit as the development in this plan seems to have gone slightly further south. So they've been squashed right down along the boundary. The bottom hedge is not a ditch. There is an issue on that field because will be a huge amount of runoff from the roads and from the buildings. And that will be the only collection point. In Axbridge, the drainage system is, you have a sewage system, foul, dirty water goes into the sewage system, clean water, rainwater goes into the ditch system. There is actually no ditch connection to this development. So attenuation is very important. So if it is agreed, then the condition, the advisory from the Drainage Board should be added as a condition. I think their letter of the 14th of March refers. That's all I have to say at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Titchener.
In terms of the Highway Authority's comments, we aren't expecting any further comments on the application. They provided their initial comments. I think there is an overlap with a separate process that was happening by the Highway Authority with the applicants on this site regarding, when I mentioned the WEL lines, they have to go through a process called the Section 278 processes, where you have to agree means of access to a highway, but not in planning terms. Planning's already happened, but actually just the very detailed technical design of what that looks like, and there's a legal agreement that they will agree with the Highway Authority, not with us, to cover that, and that's going on separately, and that's where the WEL alignment is coming out. So we're not expecting any more planning comments per se. It's just that process is ongoing separately, and that's a normal process that would happen. In terms of the play area being next to the road, we just reviewed the plans, and so the play area is to be fenced in. So that's one of the requirements that they would have. We do know on the plans that it does show that, so it's got two sets of gates to access a play area, and one of those is on the northern side of the play area, and there's one on the southern side. And on the northern side is the side that's closest to Holgate Way. Now, there may well need, if members felt this is something we need to revisit, but is that the most appropriate location for those gates? You know, is it directing children in the direction of the road potentially, and maybe actually somewhere a gate's located sort of that more direct them back towards the southern parts of the site might be something that we could revisit if members felt that was appropriate. So in terms of the attenuation ponds and their position and size, I mean, the size of the attenuation ponds will ultimately be dictated by the technical calculations that have to underpin the drainage assessment in terms of the areas of built form. So that will determine the size of it, and then we will consult the specialists, consultees, the drainage board on and the Lead Local Flood Authority on those matters, and they're satisfied that they've been calculated correctly and designed appropriately. We're more than happy to, of course, add any informatives regarding the advisories that the drainage board have offered. I hope that covers most of the points there.
And landscaping. It's a query.
And just in terms of the landscaping, about the need to sort of build that up. I mean, there's quite a bit of habitat provision secured through the habitat regulations assessment and control via conditions on the outline, which the ecologists were satisfied. So that includes sort of retention of those hedgerow boundaries on the left. If I just come into the site, in terms of the hedgerow boundary on the west is also to be retained, and the hedgerow boundary along the southern side. So the hedgerows that have to come out effectively is this sort of hedgerow dissecting here. But the ecologists they do calculations as part of the habitat regulation assessment to work out what is the net change in habitats vis-a-vis the development beforehand and after it's gone in, and are satisfied with the proposals put in with the retention of those hedgerows and all the planting that's going as part of the scheme, that it delivers what they need it to deliver in terms of a no net loss. So I hope that covers that point.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Bolt, you indicated. Can we pass the mic down?
Thank you. Just a query with regards, this car park's been referred to as a public car park, as opposed to just for residents. It's obviously down by the centre, the medical centre, which has got, and by the access way out onto the road there. I'm assuming from what was said originally during the presentation that the highways will be adopted, or the roadways will be adopted by the council, or sorry, by highways. What will happen to that car park? If it's classed as a public car park, will that become suddenly a pay and display cash machine?
So the intention is that the car park would be managed by the management company. So that as would things like public open space within the site. So it's typical that a developer would have to set up a company. If they don't want to transfer it to the authority, then they have to set up a management company that will oversee the long-term adoption. And just in terms of your point about the adoption of the roads, I mean, that's a separate process that is this effectively what's called the Section 38 process that an applicant can enter into to see if the Highway Authority will adopt the roads, but not everyone will want to do that. You know, that's not necessarily something that always happens at every site. An applicant will retain some of the roads under their own management company. It's the provisions are there under the Section 38 if needed.
Going on from that, is it if it stays as a management company and any member can, as a public, can go and park there, can we put restrictions to stop them from charging and putting on private car parking charges?
I'll just come in on this. No. If it's their land and they want to run it the way they want to run it and it ends up being a charged car park, then that's their right to do so. So our right in planning is not to remove their right to use their land. In terms of the car park, you know, obviously as part of the outline planning permission, they have to provide it. It has to be available. There'll be triggers in the 106 in terms of when it has to be available. The intention of the developer, who is the landowner, who is developing the site with the residential units, will be to provide that for the benefit of residents and existing residents of the surrounding area. But how they manage and maintain it in the future, if they keep it under a management company, if they end up charging per use or charging the household for long-term maintenance, that's a separate issue outside of planning.
Councillor Bolt, then I've got Councillor Betty, then I've got Councillor Richards.
Just a little concern there that we're classing those 26. If you took those away because they're paying or paying display or whatever, does that take them out of the equation? Thank you. I take the head shake there as a no.
I think that they're still publicly available, whether they're charged or not. So in terms of the purpose of the 106 is to secure the spaces, as long as the spaces are there and been provided, how they charge it and how they maintain it is down to the individual landowner.
When we've been dealing with some applications in some of the more urban areas like sort of Bridgewater and Burnham, there have been issues where we look to see where public car parks are available, whether they're charged or not. So it is the availability rather than the method of provision. Councillor Betty.
Thank you, Chairman. I do welcome the need for 1, 2 and 2 bed houses in areas. I mean, there's very many rural areas without these 1 and 2 bed houses, so it will help keep the younger members of the community in the village, in the towns and villages. Could I just ask if the Axbridge Town Council have had a recent housing needs survey so that these affordable homes that will be on site will be the correct ones for the housing needs of those in Axbridge?
Mr. Tidger. Or Mrs. Ruth.
They don't actually need a housing needs survey for this site because you're looking at housing needs surveys for exceptional release of sites. This one's already got an outline. It's policy compliant under the standard policies rather than the exceptional release policies. In terms of the balance of tenure, so the type of properties, the number of bedrooms, the properties, etc., that's all been shared through the affordable housing manager, and he's confirmed he's happy with the mix in terms of what the need is for Axbridge in general, but there isn't a specific housing needs assessment that would need to be met in this case because it's already got outline planning permission. It's not an exceptional release application.
So if that is the case, if they're, well, from what I understand, but will these affordable homes be able to be issued to the local people first? Can we put something in as a condition so that the affordable homes are given to those in Axbridge that need them first, that are on housing needs?
The question is there a local lettings policy in terms of the section 106?
We are checking, but while we're checking, I will just infill a little bit. It is a strategic allocated site. So as a strategic allocated site, it doesn't necessarily have to have one because it is meeting the strategic need for Sedgemoor. But we are checking to see whether there is one in the 106, but we have to check that on the outline planning permission because that would have been secured at that point if it was considered necessary, but it's not a policy requirement because it is a strategic allocation to deal with overall strategic growth for Sedgemoor.
Okay. I think while we're looking, I'll move on to other members and we'll come back to that. So, Councillor Richards.
Thank you very much. Coming back to the position of the play area, clearly there it's going to be attractive to children from off the site, particularly Holgate Way, Stars Close. That there could be a lot of kids wanting to cross Holgate Way. So they're either going to come directly across, depending, I'm coming back to the issue that was mentioned by Mr. Titchen about where the gates are. So I think there needs to be careful thought, because either you're going to have kids running across the road at numerous places to get to a gate, or they're going to have to go down and cross the road to get onto the footpath access near the doctor's surgery. So I do think there needs to be a lot more thought about that, unless that's already taken place, which you can brief us about. The other issue, while I also support what's been said before about maximising as much biodiversity provision. So, I mean, swift boxes, I mean, it would be good to see swift boxes in this sort of development. Swifts are seen flying around over Cheddar, over Axbridge, in those areas. They travel big distances. That would be a good place to have swift boxes. And the final thing I'll ask about that hasn't been mentioned but was highlighted a few times in the report and commented on by the planning officer was the concerns from the medical centre about privacy. And you mentioned, Mr. Titchener, in your report that you're satisfied that 20-metre separation is adequate to provide privacy. And I guess if the doctor's surgery was really worried, they could put up a palings fence to stop people looking in. But I wonder what the arrangements are going to be during the construction phase. A bit more detail on what the planting is, and there will be a number of years before the planting provides adequate screening for the doctors' consulting rooms. Have you discussed with the surgery and with the staff their concerns and how they will be addressed? Because I don't think this has been adequately addressed in your report. Thank you.
Mr. Titchener.
Yeah, so the doctor's surgery, which is located here, sent in a comment, said they had some concern, and this is in the report, but just about the potential impact on their consulting privacy of their consulting rooms. And if I just come on to where the, if I just get a layout plan up. So that's the doctor's surgery there. So I guess the closest provision is sort of the public car park, which is sort of offset slightly from it. So the doctor's surgery has some windows here, and then there's the residences here. I mean, the 20 meters separation in terms of privacy is about, that's a rule that we would use in terms of protecting privacy of residents. So if you're a resident living in your property, that you're not looking at anyone else's window, or no one else is going to look in your window from their property, a separation that's perhaps less than 20 meters. So that's a particular test we might apply to someone in their house. In terms of the doctor's surgery, about sort of the privacy of their consulting rooms, I mean, there are some things obviously they can do in terms of maintaining that privacy, is put up to boundary treatments. I mean, I think it's only an issue, you know, if I guess if they've got their windows open to get into the nitty gritty of it, you know, in good weather, because it's, I think if you're having if you're having a confidential meeting with a doctor, you know, they tend to take measures to protect the privacy of the people going in there, using their own screens and things like this. So, you know, as I know when I've been for appointments myself, I don't know if that, I mean, in terms of the design, what we've tried to do is what the applicants have tried to do is make sure things like that require that, such like dwellings aren't in close proximity to the doctor's surgery, because dwellings are places where people will dwell. So if you had someone's garden, for example, backing on to where the boundary with the doctor's surgery is, then I could see that there would potentially be a real issue there, because you would have people in their back gardens. So if their back gardens were along this sort of point, you know, and the windows are open, but what they've done here is it kept only sort of public areas here, so with some green space and the car park, so areas where people aren't going to be spending significant portions of time. So just to give some buffering and some degree of separation and a bit of space from the doctor's surgery. So that's how we sort of got to where we are. I mean, in terms of planting, you said it will take some time. Yes, it will take some time to get established. That's always the case, and it's not going to happen immediately. And planting will go in one of the sort of the later sort of phases, because they don't want the plant. They have to do the sort of the bigger engineering works before and building before planting goes in. So I take that point that there will be a bit of a lag before the planting gets fully grown, and that's certainly acknowledged. I missed anything else there? To say what to say about that. And just related to that, I mean, there is a construction phase environmental management plan on the outline. So there is a condition already on the outline due there to put in protections for existing things like which requires some fences and things to go up, so for protection of existing sort of hedgerows and the like. So there are protections in place already secured in the outline, just to provide some controls in terms of the management of the construction element.
Okay, Councillor Richards.
So could there be in a condition a temporary fence put up until the screening has become established, and then surely everybody would be happy? It does seem to be a special case to me that, you know, and unless you've had recent meetings with the doctor's surgery staff or management, and you know, have they confirmed that they're now happy?
Normally, as part of a construction management plan, what we would see is some form of fencing or enclosure around the site to ensure that there's not going to be any adverse impact through the start of the development process. Yeah, and officers are happy. We could add a condition to be detailed, details to be agreed, and the applicant seems happy with that. So we could add that as a condition. Of the points that you were raising earlier, I think the only other thing that isn't covered already by conditions was B bricks. So it's for members to think further if B
Swift boxes.
I think Swift boxes would have been considered as part of the habitats regulations assessment, and with that you look at the balance of species that are available and which ones you want to encourage in certain areas and which ones you don't. So my concern, if we're looking for Swift boxes, is that's quite particular, and we haven't got the evidence base to sort of justify that approach.
Why don't you not specify where it is? Further details to be agreed, and we can get the right mix with the county colleges.
Yeah. So we could enhance the conditions from the outline, requiring further details to be submitted in terms of enhancements. Could be B bricks, could be Swift boxes, but to be agreed with the county ecologists, and then that way it would add to the level of enhancement we've already got on the outline planning permission.
Issue about the use of the play area by
the play area
off-site, just safety issues of crossing the road and accessing.
In terms of the location plan, the play area is centrally located within the green space, so it's got an amount of landscaping around the outside of it, so it's not immediately on the highway. It is fenced in. We can work with the developer to renegotiate, if we need to, the location of the access points, just to make sure there's none that would go immediately straight into the highway. But from the layout, I don't think there would, but we could always take that back to be agreed with the chair and vice chair in terms of the position of the fencing. That said, the speed limit of the road is supposed to be 20 miles an hour. I did hear the comments raised about speeding traffic, and obviously if there is an enforcement issue there, that is something that should be raised with the county highways team, because at 20 miles an hour, particularly if you've got a play area that particularly children from the surrounding estates would want to visit, you'd want to make sure that that's sort of safe for them to do so. But it, you know, in the given limits of the speed limit that's in force for that road, 20 miles an hour, they should be safe to cross the road in an appropriate location. But obviously we can work on the location of the access gates.
Members who've indicated to speak, but I'm going to come back on the local lettings policy that we were looking into. There isn't. Okay. So as it's set up at the moment, it would be through Home Finder Somerset that people would apply, and that would then be allocated. Okay, I've got Councillors Pearce and then Councillor Hendry. So Councillor Pearce.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I certainly I'm pleased to see the inclusion of solar and EV charging points, given the need for new housing This is something that many of us have been wanting to see for a long time. So that's really good news. And it's good to see the provision of affordable housing within it. And I'd certainly support the change to access to play areas if that's going to help, and the inclusion of more sort of bee bricks and bird boxes. My question really is around the element where it sort of goes in the curve because of the nearby chicken farm. Can you remind me of, are there any planting schemes along there to act as a buffer to aid, which would also help the environmental and wildlife elements as well? Thank you.
Ms. Titchler. So just to clarify, you're talking about this sort of boundary here, are you? Is it? I mean, so that defines sort of the red line. So we can only secure development within the red line of the application, not on the external side, unfortunately. So I take your point that, you know, planting in that location may well have been helpful, but it falls outside the red line of what we can secure on this application.
Councillor Hendry.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to the case officer for a very detailed presentation. Given that outline PP has already been granted, it moves things on at a very fast pace, given we're doing reserved matters. There are several points. Statutory consultees all seem to be on board with this. There's no major problem to speak of that would actually stop the application in its tracks. Specifically highways and ecology, they're the big ones. Councillor Scott pointed out about the drainage at the bottom end, south end of the site, which I wasn't aware of. I never picked that up, but perhaps she's got a good point there about the ditches and drainage. I didn't get the technical stuff on it. I didn't pick it up. As regarding the LEAP, that seems to have been upgraded from a lab previously. That's the way I pick up on the paperwork anyway. Children's health and well-being is always paramount. That's number one. So if the access and entry has to be looked at, then so be it. A few of the councillors pointed that out, and obviously Charlie Rich as a councillor pointed out too, and quite rightly so. That really does have to be looked at. If there's a speed enforcement type of thing on Howgate Way, that's a police matter, not really for planning as it comes. So we can't stop a planning application because somebody happens to be speeding on Howgate Way. There's no reason why they couldn't put a speed camera there, to be honest, or even speed bumps, which seems to be quite regular these days, and it would curb the speeding. Nobody's going to go over 48 mile an hour on speed bumps. Generally speaking, the thing looks actually really good to me, the whole outline. I don't see a big problem with this. There might be a few amendments, as we just spoke about anyway. There's a public right-of-way at the top at the north side, which I think is going to be retained to the public right-of-way. Everything's actually kind of moving off in the right direction as it stands, but yes, there could be a few amendments maybe to the drainage and the children's play area. That's minor details. On the back of that, what I've just said and what everybody else has just said, and I read the paperwork, I propose we grant permission. Thank you.
Thank you. And just to confirm, in terms of the extra conditions we're looking at is a condition relating to sorting out the fencing of the site, particularly during the construction management and between the doctors, the resolution of the gates for the play area, further details relating to the wildlife issues relating to bee bricks, bird boxes,
it seems to be
with the ecologist,
yeah,
and an informative relating to the drainage board relating to that flooding issue potentially at the bottom
the drainage
of the site.
board's one of the big ones, so yes, absolutely. And it seems to be the bat box situation has been taken care of already. It didn't seem that from the outset, but after hearing what the case officer put across, that as far as I'm concerned is okay and it's been taken care of. So yes, I propose we grant permission. Thank you.
Okay. If I could just get a clarification as well, because obviously the issue was raised about the off-site footpath. My understanding is the advice that in effect we've given is because that's not dealt with at outline, in effect we can't condition that at this point. But obviously the applicants are in the room, they've heard the discussions and the support for that, and whether there's something that others can deal with out of this forum, that may be something that would be a conversation elsewhere. Any further? Yeah, I've got Councillors Bolt and then Councillor Grimes.
Thank you. I'm quite happy to second the recommendation with the
extra bits. Okay. Councillor Grimes. No. Okay. Councillor Scott.
Thank you, Chairman. I wonder if I'd be permitted to add a couple more conditions. I should have mentioned it earlier, actually. Because there's a small shortfall in the parking provision, is it possible to retain the garages as garages and not to not permit residential conversion in the future? I understand that's been done. That would sort of safeguard some of the parking. And also, there was concern about the parking of the workers and the actual hours of working here on this site. I don't know if that's already been conditioned.
Mr. Titchener, can you advise on the removal of permitted removal of protection of the garages in effect for garaging, and also whether there's anything included in the outline condition relating to the construction management hours of operation?
So in terms of garages, it is something that we've done on other schemes historically, is to remove the permitted development right that effectively allows people to convert a garage, to another use without first submitting a planning application. So if someone wanted to turn it into internal accommodation, they need to put an application to us. So we can add that as an additional condition as some assurance. It doesn't force someone to park their car in a garage, for example, but it does offer some control. The other point is about hours of operation. There is an existing condition on the outline that controls sort of construction operation hours. So we wouldn't need to impose any further condition. The applicant would already have to abide by the one on the outline.
Okay, so if I could ask Councillors Hendry and Councillor Bolt, you happy with the removal of permitted development rights in terms of the garage? I would just emphasise that doesn't stop someone applying in the future to convert it. It just means they can't do it without permission.
It's a little bit ambiguous, a little bit controversial, but if it's okay with everybody else, I'll go along with it.
Okay, Councillor Bolt, you happy with that? Okay, so that's with that as an additional condition as well. So are members clear as to what the proposal is? Okay, so we have the recommendation then to grant permission with the amended conditions. All those in support, please show. And any against, please show. And any abstentions? That's 12, and that's right. That's all members voted. So that is clearly carried. So permission is granted. I'm going to suggest, members, we have a short comfort break at that point. We'll restart at about 10 past. Hopefully, drinks have been. Okay. Members, if we can restart, then we'll move to our next application. We have a speaker present. That's on page 35 and North Petherton. And Mr. Noon.
Thank you, Chairman. This is an application at Somerset View Caravan Park to change the use of the caravan park to provide a permanent park home site for residential occupation. It would also involve some reorganisation of the site, and what they're showing on the plans is a sort of 60 pitches to be each to be occupied by a park home site that could then be occupied for permanent residential use. I do have some updates in terms of a letter that's been provided in support of the application by an agent for the application. I will come to that at the end of my presentation, because it sort of ties up with my sort of summing up. So to go through the detail, here is the site edged in red. It's an existing caravan site, south side of North Petherton. So you can see the ploughed field on next to the road there, and the thin one next to it. That obviously is now being developed as the North Petherton housing allocation. So the built form of Petherton has moved south since Google flew over, and then to the west you can see the Follyfoot strawberry farm, and the rugby club is just in next to the site here. To move in slightly, zoomed in. The access is off the sort of lay-by that runs to the side east of the A38. So the access is in this corner here. Then there are a number of roads laid around the site where we currently have, I think it's about 50 statics in this area of the site to sort of the west and the south. We have a facilities block in the middle, a small reception block just at the entrance here, And then this is sort of generally it's still touring caravans in the area around the service block and just the either side of it. And there are about 30 odd touring pitches there, so about 80 on site at the moment. Those are currently occupied by Hinckley workers as per their flexible permission that was granted a couple of years ago. Just to give us sort of policy context, where we are, caravan site just next to the rugby ground, which is a protected sort of open space. And then you can see the North Peverton allocations in pink, which are now built out. The built form stops sort of about here, and then the attenuation pond. So there would still be a gap between this site and the new southern edge of Peverton once that allocation is built out. The existing settlement boundary is in green there. Just moving on to the application. This is the layout from the most recent approval for the flexible use of the site, which essentially allows holiday makers or Hinckley workers for a couple of years thereafter to revert to holiday use only. The effect of this application is to remove that requirement to revert to holiday use, and it will just be open residential. So that layout shows, I think, 59 static units, and the proposal is just in sort of higher, sort of zoomed out a bit just to show the context, is a sort of a new layout, new units. The roads would all be made good. There are some that are tarmacked at the moment, some that aren't, but the idea is, you know, the proposal would be to sort of improve the site, provide new statics, and sort of do the layout with sort of high quality tarmacked with curved edges, as befits a residential site. Zoomed in there. So we retain the facilities block. That will be a shared use. Provide an element of landscaping, parking within the site, and that would then sort of, you know, become this new residential park home site. The area to the south would be retained as its current use, which is, again, it's got Hinckley use on it for a couple of years thereafter to revert to holiday use only. That this is a layer of sliver at the bottom southern edge here, that's unaffected by this application. This is, yes, hopefully that is clear. This is just the drawing that we've been provided of the static unit that is proposed. It would meet the definitions of a caravan, so it would still be a caravan sited on the land. It's a 2-bedroom unit with open plan living space. It's sort of rendered finish tile effect roof. But that is what is, you know, envisaged for the site. To come on to the photographs, this is the sort of the view looking south along that lay-by. The entrance to the site is just in front of that parked van. Looking back the other, so the rugby club's in on the left. This really sort of shows us sort of a lack of this, you know, the pavement isn't complete all the way from the site to the edge of Peverton at the moment. That is missing. That's one of the areas of concern. And then just looking back the other way on the same point, you see the pavement then picks up, starts to exist the other side of the rugby club entrance, and then goes up to Peverton. It's quite narrow, it's quite overgrown. I'll come back to that in a while at the end. Moving on then, just looking back up, sort of stood in the road, there is a pavement sort of, you know, running up to the new development that you can see has now moved the edge of Peverton south towards the site. And then a look into the site as it currently is. And then just stood, courtesy of Google Earth, just looking down. That's the other way, at the other end of the southern end of that lay-by. You can turn in right there. And then sort of having gone up the entrance into the site, and then looking sort of to the right as you get to the top of the little hill that leads into it, you can see the roof of the facilities block there, and then here's the area of mostly touring caravans and a few statics dotted in there. That's the little reception block which you see when you get to come up the top of the hill into the site, and then that sort of line of conifers is the boundary with the rugby club you can see behind. And then just looking into that area of touring caravans, I'm going to try and sort of take you sort of west, sort of basically anti-clockwise through the site. So there's a top area tour as the hedge you see on the right over here. That's the other side of that is the A38. There's that facilities block with touring caravans, just in more detail there. That provides sort of washroom facilities, laundry, toilet shower facilities. So it's all general all-purpose facilities block that would be retained, be available for future users. Walking past that, looking back towards the entrance, there's the conifers with the rugby club behind it. There's the little reception building is just there. There's just sort of more detail through that area, the mix of tourers, and then the statics you can see is having gone across to the western side looking down. There are the current arrangement of static units going down to the bottom, looking along basically towards the southwest. Again, you can see this is all unmade up road. This would be made up properly if the application were to be approved. There again, just sort of general view looking sort of west, southwest along the bottom, and then looking back the other way along the bottom of the site, the conifers with the rugby club behind, and then going down to the far end, looking back up towards the entrance, conifers on the right, rugby club on the right. So in coming to the key issues, and the applicant has provided quite a lengthy letter that's seeking to address the 8 reasons for refusal reported today. They make a number of suggestions and ideas as to how those reasons for refusal could be overcome. However, whilst suggestions are made, there is no evidence in there that could be considered and consulted on and therefore reported back in a sort of complete form. So from that point of view, my recommendation essentially stands, but I will also go through what they are saying. In terms of it being an unallocated site outside the settlement boundary, there is no exceptions policy that would allow the release of additional housing land outside North Peverton. In terms of the site itself, we don't consider it meets the definition, the NPPF definition of brownfield, in that the vast majority of the structures are temporary. And they are just static caravans. The idea of a tourism site, if it fails, it closes, everything's removed. The site is not then the brownfield for the purpose of development. We accept there is hard standing there. We accept there are a couple of buildings there, but they are very much ancillary to the main use of the site. So we don't consider it qualifies as brownfield development opportunity. In terms of the second reason for refusal, the applicant is maintaining that the site isn't a viable tourism site. Whilst they have provided a letter from an agent sort of who specialises in the marketing of tourism sites, we don't consider that this is sort of the level of, doesn't meet the test that required in policy D17 in terms of evidencing that a site is not viable for tourism purposes. So we think the second reason for refusal still stands. It may be that evidence could be produced in the form of a proper marketing report, but it doesn't form part of this application. In terms of the layout of the site, third reason for refusal, we don't consider that the layout is appropriate for a permanent residential occupation, someone's home. Whilst there may be an option to provide an amended layout that would provide more landscaping, better space, amenity space, address concerns about overlooking, we don't have that as part of this application. We do acknowledge that the site licence will have something to say about the layout and whatnot of caravans. However, that doesn't address the planning consideration that we look at in terms of residential amenity. That will certainly deal with things like fire risk and what have you. But in terms of the amenity side of things, in a planning policy context, we don't feel that we've been given something that would allow us to reconsider the reason for refusal that's in the report. In terms of the fourth reason for refusal, the applicant is suggesting that the existing traffic movements would not fundamentally change as a result of this proposal. And they've even suggested that an age restriction would sort of curb that sort of, the concern that the highways officer has sort of raised about patterns of movement would change as a result of going residential. However, again, we got no traffic assessment to demonstrate that, nothing to sort of quantify the existing movements or to analyse what the proposed movements would be. So on that basis, that reason for refusal we think stands. Could be addressed, but we don't have that as part of this application. Fifth reason for refusal, it has been offered by the applicant that they would be willing to address the pavement issue, to provide that missing link of pavement between the site entrance and the rugby club entrance, provide improvements along the pavement going towards North Peverton. That may well be the case. We don't know anything about the ownership, whether that is possible, and we don't have anything to show where that could be done. So again, whilst that might be addressed in more detail or in a resubmission, we don't have that today as evidence to overcome that fifth reason for refusal. In terms of the sixth reason, whilst amendments to the layout that I've suggested could be needed to address residential amenity, may also address parking. Again, we don't have those changes to layout, so the parking reason I think still stands. Seventh reason is he contended that park homes by their nature would meet the NPPF's definition of low-cost affordable housing. Now, that may be the case. They are cheaper than bricks and mortar. However, we've got no evidence as to how that would make it affordable to someone who is in need of affordable housing. So our concern about the lack of affordable housing or a contribution or some mechanism to address the requirements of D6 is not with this application. So that reason stands. And they haven't really picked up on the point about the contribution towards doctor surgery. At the moment, the site is supposed to be occupied by Hinckley workers. They have provision for healthcare as part of their job. They're not making demands on the local services. So we think that is a reasonable request, and that stands. In terms of the final reason for refusal, in terms of drainage, a little bit out of order from my slides, so apologies. It's accepted that the site is at low risk of flooding. But it's in flood zone 1, but we do say that the surface water drainage strategy needs to be sort of detailed as part of the application. A major application should have that with it. And we'd also pick up there on foul water, but the application is silent on that at the moment. Again, it's a technical matter that could be addressed with more details or into resubmission. And then my final point, just sort of picking up on something that's also suggested in the applicant's supporting letter. It suggested that temporary permissions, as we have granted at this site twice for Hinckley workers now, are not something that should be done under the NPPF. The NPPF is very sort of advises caution on that, saying you shouldn't grant repeated temporary permissions. We think, however, that's not that is justified in this case, because we are seeking to address the need for housing for Hinckley workers, which is over quite a long time scale, and those housing objectives that Hinckley need to address they're on them all the time. It's always moving. They're trying to find ways of doing that. So we're not suggesting that we would, on these Hinckley permissions, give them 10 years for the whole construction period. We are suggesting that we need to review them regularly, which is why they are short, and it's why it is reasonable in this instance, backed up by our own supplementary guidance, to grant successive temporary permissions. So we don't think that weighs against this application. It is suggested it's a rationale to approve this one in that we've had 2 temporary permissions, or into the second one now. The use has been there for 5 or 6 years, and there's no evidence in that that their contention is of any substantive problem arising from that. Again, that is something that is not sort of evidenced in terms of addressing all the reasons for refusal I'm suggesting. It is regrettable that we've got so many reasons for refusal, but I felt it was helpful to everyone, including the applicant, to split them up so they can be addressed, in resubmission. Or I have suggested this application be withdrawn or deferred. The applicant is adamant that the application comes to you today for determination without withdrawal or deferral. So that is my recommendation of refusal, unchanged by the information that's been provided. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, as you'll see, we've got a speaker, Nayan Gandhi. Would you like to come forward, please? Good morning again. You'll see the time on the clock. Start whenever you're ready, please.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee on behalf of the applicants. They are proposing a high-quality, peaceful 60-unit retirement home site at Somerset View Caravan Park. The scheme is recommended for refusal as officers find it contrary to local plan policies CO1, CO3, and D17 and others. We disagree with the officer's assessment, and I'll briefly set out why. On policy CO3, the site meets the NPPF definition for brownfield sites. The officer has dismissed the presence of a toilet block as being relatively small, but is bigger than most houses. measuring at 18 meters by 7 meters and being 1.5 stories tall. There are some 20 concrete bases, tarmac roads, and a septic facility on site. It is previously developed land. In terms of the policy test for residential use, in our view, it passes them all. It is reasonably well located to North Petherton, a Tier 1 settlement, being adjacent to the rugby club and a new residential extension to the town. Residents will be able to walk to the centre via the existing footpath in 13 minutes, according to Google Maps. The proposals also meet the policy test for policy DP17 regarding the loss of tourist accommodation. The site is not viable. It has only had one inquiry in 6 years, despite a website and a large sign on the A38 that you've no doubt seen. A leading chartered surveyor has confirmed this via an independent market assessment. The financial figures cited in the original committee report earnestly referred to the operation of the HPC workers and not for holidays. It simply can't compete with the recently built nationally branded Premier Inn and Holiday Inn Express at Motorway Junction 24, nor with the beachside accommodation at Breen and Burnham-on-Sea. The policy, in fact, allows for less than 2 years of marketing in certain circumstances, and we think that applies here. It also meets the requirements of policy CO1, as environmental enhancements can be achieved via the provision of significant new landscape planting throughout the site, as you've seen from the photographs. This can be secured by condition. In terms of access, the site already accommodates at least 60 caravans for HPC workers for the past 6 years without any issues. The proposals would at least be a like-for-like swap, or indeed a betterment, as retirees prefer to avoid traveling during peak hours. Suitable amenity, parking, and drainage standards will be secured via caravan site licensing process in the same way as Chiltern Park in Bridgewater. The scheme will deliver 60 park homes that can be identified as affordable or low-cost housing. In terms of the NHS provision, the applicant isn't objecting to that. It's a matter of whether, in case law terms, it can meet the tests for this in the MPPF. The Town Council and the District Council both support the scheme, and we all agree that the proposals are policy compliant with the key policies of the local plan. We respectfully request that the planning permission is granted. Thank you again for the opportunity to address the committee.
Thank you. Perfectly fine. Thank you. Members, any comments or questions, please? We'll start with Councillor Kingham.
With these becoming full residential, does it mean that they have 52 weeks of the year to occupy them, so there's no time off?
What they are suggesting is a full permanent residential occupation, 365 days of the year.
Councillor Pearce.
Thank you, Chairman. The Speaker mentioned this being a retirement development, but the application as we've got before us on page 36 of our report says that it's a residential park home site with unrestricted occupation. I mean, this really concerns me because it is not policy compliant on so many issues as set out before us, and I would worry this is sort of housing by the back door. And I know we have to accept every application on its own merits, but I would hate for it to set a precedent. So as things stand, I'm minded to agree with the officer's recommendation.
Thank you. Got Councillor Grimes and Councillor Richards.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm sorry I can't support this application. The site owners asked for Hinckley workers, which was granted, and I can't see any reason to change the existing permission to revert back to holiday use. I'll just wait for what other councillors have to say on this issue, but I can't support this. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Richards.
Thank you. I'd just like to understand a little bit more about the affordability likelihood of, so these are, from what we're hearing now, these are retirees looking for affordable retirement accommodation. I'm just trying to sort of get my head around this. So what does affordability mean for that sector of the community? Thank you.
The option to condition this to restrict the age to the over 55s has been made quite late in the application, which is why it's not in the officer report, but it is suggested that this could address some of the concerns. Now, obviously, we would need the supporting information to bring all that together to show how that can happen, to consider that. But in terms of the affordability, it is suggested that a typical mobile, well, I don't know if there's such a thing, but a mobile home would cost around between 200 and 250,000 of the figures suggested. Now, the NPPF does sort of acknowledge that low cost market housing, so at a good reduction below the average, can be regarded as affordable. Now, when you're dealing with bricks and mortar, that's maybe quite a straightforward proposition to get your head around in terms of the cost of acquiring and owning a home. There's no evidence here to show that a mobile home at that price would meet the needs of those in affordable housing, because I don't understand personally the economics of funding a mobile home. But yeah, I may have got this wrong, but again, I'm doing my best to understand it because it's not all put together here. But I don't think a mobile home is an appreciating asset that you could borrow on a mortgage basis against. I would need more understanding as to how they would be affordable to those in need to be able to agree. It may be the case, but we just don't have that supporting information as part of the current application.
Thank you. I must admit, from my own point of view, as things stand at the moment, the application we have in front of us, we've now had information given that tries to address a number of the issues that have come up through the process. It just feels to me at this stage that we haven't had the ability for either ourselves or in fact residents of the surrounding area to take all those things into account. Could I just ask, is this the first application on this site of this nature? So were this application refused, then there is the ability to come back with a free go in effect?
It would be a free go for 12 months from the date of the decision.
And from my own point of view, it feels like there's so many things to address here. That almost feels like that's the safest way to go, both for the applicants and for ourselves. And it gives them the opportunity to find that time to prove the evidence that they want to put before us to justify what is here. Because, as was mentioned by Councillor Pearce, this would be quite a fundamental decision and might have other knock-on effects elsewhere, bearing in mind there are other sites similar to this across the Sedgemoor area. So I think it's something that we would need to take into account. I've got Councillor Betty next.
Thank you, Chairman. You stole my thunder. I was going to ask that. So with that in mind, I would recommend the officer's recommendation of refusal, that, and hopefully the applicant can come back with the relevant information and that on a fresh plan so that it can be seen and demonstrated what they're trying to do here.
Thank you. Councillor Scott.
It is on. Yeah, I actually would second that actually, because my concerns are that we haven't got all the information here today, and I would be concerned that as it's now intended for older people, that they'd actually be suitable for older people, given their location and the services available. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions that any other members have? So at the moment, then, we have the recommendation to refuse permission, both proposed and seconded. All those in favour, please show. That's unanimously carried, so that's clearly carried. Thank you. That moves us to page 72 as the next page where we have a speaker present. And we move to Western Zoyland and we welcome back Mr. Titchener. That one. Yes. Oh, okay. Okay, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Chairman.
This is an application. It's on land which is called land to the east of the runway at Folly Farm. Land, but effectively it's on land that was part of the former Western Oil Airfield. People will more readily know it as. It's a retrospective application for the change of use of part of the former runway for the storage and blending of horticultural growing media. So compost, in effect. The application is before members due to the objection of the parish council. The area of the site. So this is Western Island, and the former airfield is located on a large area of land to the east. So the A372 runs through the middle of it, and there's various sections of former runway, but this is one of the main sections of former runway which runs along parallel with the A372. And the proposal site incorporates land which is just on the north section of the A372. These are only operational bits of the runway that still take place much further over to the west. So this is just showing an aerial view in much closer detail. So this is part of the runway here where the application relates, and I'll put up the site location plan in a second. So the A372 is on its southern side. You have this sort of small road called Burdenham Drove, which just runs up, provides sort of the access, and that's sort of linked onto the A372 here. So as it's a former runway, it's just a concrete strip runway. There is some sort of scrubby boundary treatment on the site adjoining the highway. It's quite intermittent. There's no boundary treatment to the north, so the site's very sort of flat and sort of open to the north. So just here, and you can see it sort of here to the north, is another part of the former runway where there is an existing consent which was given in 2013 for the storage of similar materials, so the similar sort of soil sort of piles for a similar type of use. So that's been in operation for about 10 years. On the west side of former part of the runway, there's also another consent which was given for the storage of stone chippings and plants associated with the use as a highway depot. So that hasn't taken place in the last couple of years. They were making use of it a couple of years ago. Effectively, it was sort of like a seasonal highways team that the county council employed as subcontractors would use it to store piles of stone when they go out in the summer and do road work. So it was sort of seasonal only, but that hasn't been taking place recently. But involved, in terms of similarities, involved similar piles of material. So this is a red line just showing the extent of the area proposed within which the storage would take place. There are no, so it doesn't include the area to the west. So if you've been past recently, you'll see that the area where soil is currently being stored currently extends outside of the area of this red line. So there is a bigger area of soil storage and blending taking place than currently. Now, this application doesn't cover that. So if members do approve this application, there will still be an unresolved issue there to be resolved at a future date. And it would not, and as this application is enforcement generated, it would not enable us to close down our enforcement file at the current time. So we just be mindful of that. Just as part of the application, so this is the only plan we've got. So the red line plan, so there are no other plans, no permissions being sought other than for the change of use of the land. So there's no buildings proposed as part of the application. There's no structures, so we don't have any other sort of elevational plans that you might normally expect. So it's basically a red line showing within this area, if granted, the applicant can undertake storage and blending of soil piles. And these are just some photographs, so just showing some of the soil piles that were taking place at the time I did my site visit. So these photos going back a little bit now because we've had the application for some time. The weather's probably indication that it was quite some time ago. They show part of the site. So this, as I mentioned, this is sort of the little Burden Drove where the access to the site is where you turn off the A372 and then you have the gates into the site. So sort of stood here looking into the site and then you get this long sort of linear row of soil piles. So the size of the piles fluctuates over time as they're working on different piles. So they sort of tend to go up and down depending on what stage in the process they're at and how much they brought on site. So there are sort of natural variations in how big they get. Now the applicant is Durston's Garden Products. So historically their core business was digging in supply of peat-based gardening products on the levels, and they've got a sort of operation sort of near Sharpham, sort of between Walton and Glastonbury. So they currently moving away from peat digging and replacing this with an alternative, which is comprised of sort of what they call green compost and virgin wood fines mixed together. So they now have to buy in a greater quantity of raw materials than before. So that requires a greater area of storage. And once blended and bagged on the site, then they transport to their production facility at Sharpham. So this part of the runway where the soil is currently stored has long been out of use associated with the airfield, hasn't had many other uses in more recent years. As I stated, some other adjoining parts are in use for storage of similar materials, so similar piles, whether that's compost or road planings. Just in terms of looking at the principal development, so I mean, in certain circumstances, runways of airfields can be considered as brownfield land, but NPPF is clear it doesn't automatically mean that they should be developed. There are clear airfields are very large areas, and they have large areas of undeveloped land within their perimeter. So it does cause it is a particularly sort of considered view of brownfield, whether it meets the definition, and just something just to be mindful of, because just because an airfield was previously developed doesn't mean development should take place on it. Notwithstanding that, the proposal would facilitate the expansion and continued operation of a local business. And there are in this application various considerations that we do have to sort of weigh in the balance before coming to a recommendation. Again, just a few more photographs just showing views along the site, just to get a sense of it. So in terms of sort of, and in particular in terms of the landscape and visual impacts, so the landscape is very flat, as you can see from these photographs, so and which is typical of the wider surrounding area. It's very typical of Somerset Levels landscape. It is very visible from the A372, which runs past it. The existing boundary sort of scrubby treatment doesn't offer much sort of visual landscape mitigation. And as I stated, the soil piles vary in height, so I mean at their greatest, I would say they could be, a metre or a couple of metres higher than you've got here. And because of their size, you can't fully screen them from view. You're always going to be able to see them, and we would need to be mindful of that, and that's always going to play a consideration in our recommendation. So the size of them is not particularly different from that operates on the nearby consented scheme. So I mean, given their size, they are going to result in some localized landscape impact. And that can't be fully mitigated. The landscape officer is, however, of the view that additional planting on the southern boundary, so the roadside boundary, can provide some welcome mitigation, so some softening of views and a little bit of filtering. There is already on the scheme on the western side where the road planings were, there's a slightly more established boundary there, it's slightly more sort of more defined, still sort of scrubby in places, but actually it does soften the views of that side slightly more than this one does, which is currently quite open. So we accept that you're never going to fully screen the piles, but this will no doubt have some help. And the landscape officer did review a scheme that was submitted, but didn't think it was the most appropriate form of landscaping for this site. So she said, in principle, it's acceptable to landscape it, but we want a different scheme. And so we would put a condition on this permission if granted, and have discussions with the applicant about what might be the most appropriate form to put on there. We'd also propose that permitted development rights are removed, so that means that means of enclosure cannot be erected within the site. So things like fences or walls that might provide an artificial way to make the piles higher. So that would provide some way to limit the overall height. Effectively they're limited by, the width of the base of the pile, effectively. But notwithstanding that, there is some limited landscape harm which would need to be weighed in the overall balance. Again, just some more photos. This photo shows the existing soil piles. So if you're looking across the site towards sort of the Burnham Drove, you get a sense of some of the piles. Those ones are relatively high, even at this distance. And then just coming on to sort of highway matters. So the site has, this is the end of Burnham Drove where it comes out onto the A372. So it sort of emerges here with the site access just off here. So so as you can see from the top photographs, this is relatively wide access, and the below photo just shows the visibility which exists to the west, so to the east rather, when emerging. So it's a long and straight road with good visibility. And then this photograph, again, to looking back towards Western Zoyland in the other direction, shows visibility to the right. Again, it's a good visibility in that direction. The Highway Authority, in their comments, sought some clarification before providing their final comments regarding the ability of vehicles to enter at the site in forward gear, clarification over the size of visibility displays, and a technical note was provided by the applicant's consultant as in response, which Highways reviewed, and they noted that a similar operation was already taking place off the same access, so those existing soil paths which operate there, which have been doing so for 10 years, and they say that's been operating with no adverse highway impacts. So in terms of traffic generation, the Highway Authority said they expected to result in about 6 vehicle movements per day, and they were not of the view that that would result in a severe impact on the highway network. So as a result, they raised no objection. So I know the parish had have some concerns about highway implications, but given the views of the Highway Authority, we would not consider there be a basis for objection. We would, however, wish to secure the visibility space through a condition which is proposed in the report. Just on to other matters, in terms of amenity impacts, the nearest properties, there is one dwelling which is sort of 400 metres away to the southwest. Western Zoyland village itself is about 1 kilometre away further west. I know the parish has made some comments about dust impacts. Environmental Health have been consulted on this. They aren't raising an objection. They want some conditions imposed, and they wanted the same conditions imposed on as were imposed on the 2013 permission to be rolled forward to this. In terms of flood risk, the Environment Agency had originally raised concerns as part of the site was flood zone 2, but a revised FRA has been submitted, and the EA have confirmed they no longer have any objection. And originally on ecology matters, the site was caught by phosphates. However, along with other sort of parts of the district, a revision to the map about a year ago now took out large parts, and this is one of the areas that was taken out, so it's no longer affected by the issue of ecology. Natural England had raised an issue about potential for impacts on the triple SI, but following submission of further information, they are satisfied that there's no direct sort of pathways between the sites and there, so they've ruled out that they have any concerns as well. So in our view, that would sort of close off that issue. So just to summarise, the proposal would facilitate the expansion and continued operation of an existing local business. We would consider the site is a suitable location, particularly given the existing consents nearby, and taking into account, to the degree that we can, the brownfield nature of the runway, accepting that there is some localised harm, which though can be softened and reduced to an extent by planting. There aren't any other matters we would consider that can be addressed by condition. So weighing all these factors together, and it is a balance, we would recommend that the benefits of granting do outweigh the harm, and our overall recommendation is to grant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, you'll see we have a couple of speakers on this application. So if we could start with Alan Herford, if you'd like to come forward.
Yeah.
Good morning. As you know, you've got 3 minutes. Start whenever you're ready, please.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Chairman. It looks very simple on plan, this application. The Parish Council were fortunate to be addressed by the applicant and the agent some time ago, and were able to go through a number of the things in the application. The issues surrounding the application, identified at least in part as retrospective, are complex to say the least. Western Zoyland Parish Council have submitted reasoned objections on the key issues. I don't intend to relive all of them, but I'm grateful that the planning officer chose to include the whole of that submission in his report. Please take note, the issues related to flood zoning, processing, visual impact, views towards the village and across, use of the continual expansion of parts of the runways, some consented, much without consent, effects on the highway, on a very fast stretch of road, and the continued HGV movements on and off the site, as well as through the village, must be considered. If consent is to be granted, which we guess it will be, conditions largely as recommended are essential, but most importantly, they then need to be strictly enforced. The retrospective nature of the proposal illustrates the vagaries of the planning system. best shown by the planning application number and the length of time it's actually taken to get this to this committee stage. In the meantime, the use and expansion has carried forward unabated. One point, it relates to condition 4, ought to be dealing, rather than the edge of the residential property, with dust onto the main road, which with wind and dry weather is unsuitable and can be lethal. The company often wet down the mounds to keep material on site, it seems. Also not sure where some of the lorry movement figures came from, referred to by the Highway Authority. 6 per day? I was there yesterday for 3.5 minutes and there were 6 movements on and off the site at the Burnham Drove entrance in that time. One thing is certain, consent will change the vista and landscape of the airfield as long as the storage continues on site. Please look at the application. I'm sure it's going to get consent, but can we make sure that the conditions are appropriate and are fully implemented and enforced? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Clive Miller, if you'd like to come forward. Good morning again. Start whenever you're ready, please.
Good morning. I'm accompanied this morning by the applicant, Chris Durston, and we will be happy to answer any questions about the nature of the business, the challenges it faces, and the need for this permission to be granted if the committee have any questions. We do fully, of course, support the officer's recommendations, and we can confirm that the proposed planning conditions are acceptable. The report and the specialist consultee responses address all the relevant planning and highway matters, and we don't need to say anything more about those. But it's worth mentioning the wider context in which Durstons have to operate as they phase out peat-based gardening products and meet the 2024 deadline for peat sales to cease completely. And we've noted that your council declared a climate emergency around 4 years ago and agreed various actions to reduce carbon emissions.
Can I just ask you to pause 1 minute? Ask the clock seems it's all right. We'll. Are we okay again? That's all right. Well, but if you carry on and we'll start the clock again. So.
Durstons is long established and family owned with a full-time workforce of around 20 full-time employees, plus a further 50 or so jobs generated indirectly through the haulage, subcontract and other suppliers. The phasing out of peat has presented huge challenge for the survival of this traditional and locally based company, a particular aspect of which has been the need to develop and store a non-peat substitute. The Durstons' new peat-free material that forms the main ingredient for blending with fertilizers at their factory consists of the 2 more raw materials which have already been described by your officer. The green compost, had it not been recovered and composted by BIFA and other suppliers, would otherwise have gone to landfill. So as a horticultural product, it's not a waste material, doesn't require licenses for storage and transportation. The use of the additional storage space has already commenced some while ago, and the applicant has apologised for that in the application and explained that owing to the means by which the new raw materials have to be ordered, purchased and transported for blending, the amount which now needs to be stored is equivalent to a whole year's output for the company, hence the need for much more storage space than is available at their Sharpham production facility. The officers confirmed that all relevant planning policies and criteria are confirmed to have been met in this application. So we hope, therefore, that the committee will agree to support the continued survival of this company through this challenging period. And in addition to confirming that it's acceptable in planning terms, enable the ongoing contribution it is making to addressing the climate emergency, which is by preventing the oxidation of peat and the loss of carbon, as well as promotion of recycling as an integral part of its new way of working. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Again, just before I come to members, there were a couple of issues that were raised by speakers, one relating to, I think it was vehicle numbers and the conditions that were mentioned.
Just on vehicle numbers, I mean, those numbers were contained within a technical note that the applicant produced and was submitted to the Highway Authority, which the Highway Authority then reviewed. They will have been based on the information that the applicant had provided to their consultant about the nature of movements. They will be averages. There will be day-to-day fluctuations. So there may well be a different number that takes place on any particular day than on another day, up and down. But that's where that information was derived from. Just in terms of conditions, and that was more about the dust, the impact of dust potentially on the highway. I'm sort of mindful that the Highways Authority had not raised any issue. I mean, I think in terms of ways possibly to deal with it and to address some of the concerns, conditions 3 and 4 were those provided by environmental health as to reduce the impact of dust on residential amenities, but it is possible to amend the conditions. So and what something that we might do in other sites is for the applicant to be required to supply details of something like a dust management plan, so that it would still seek to achieve the same objectives as conditions 3 and 4, which are just compliance conditions, but they have to give us specific measures, and those measures might vary depending on what what's happening in the weather, for example, at the time, whether it's damping down. But we would have to agree those conditions. We would have to agree the detail via discharge conditions. So that may be something the members might feel would be helpful in addressing that particular issue.
So that's useful. Start with Councillor Kingham and then Councillor Betty.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Dust is a major factor here, I think. We had a factory producing similar product a mile and a half away, and we would get the dust from that factory in the houses and that distance. If the wind's in the right direction, you will get that dust, and it is a big problem. And obviously, the carbon problem, I find, with transport, you're transporting these materials to the site, off the site, obviously that doesn't help the carbon problem either. So whether it's the right position for this sort of industry, I don't know. Well, I reserve the right to speak later.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Betty.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd also, I have to agree with Councillor Kingham on that. There's also, for members that are not familiar, there's also another active runway, which is on the opposite side of the road, which is Middlejoy Aerodrome. So that one's in use as well and is used quite often as well by aircraft. So there are many aircrafts now going around in that area. So that's just something to bear in mind. With the dust issue, there's always in the summer, there's dust flying up across the road. So you drive with your windows shut up on hot days. Another issue is the how the drainage works from this. If very often during wet weather, rainy days, the Aerodrome Road is A372 is always full, sometimes right across the road with water. What is going to be done to stop runoff from this, extra runoff from this, to stop this road becoming, well, impassable due to the flooding of it? Another thing is, I believe that we, next time, if it comes or anything, that we should have more up-to-date photos. The photos shown on there, as you said, are from last summer by the looks of it, whereas now it's drastically different on the aerodrome compared to what those photos are showing.
Thank you. Mr. Titchener, are you able to particularly comment on the water issues in terms of flooding and runoff?
Yeah, so the applicant was asked to provide additional drainage information to satisfy the needs of statutory consultees about whether there was the potential for a drainage issue, and that included doing some very detailed topographical surveying, and that was also needed to satisfy Natural England, because Natural England's concern was the water was going to run off in the direction of the SSSI, so, which is over the road, so in the direction of the road. The information they showed is actually drainage, despite the relatively flat nature of the site, the actual drainage is directed to the north. So if there are existing surface water issues on the road, it's probably quite unlikely they're being caused by this site, because with the detailed information that we've had shows that actually the water is being directed away from the road rather than towards it, and the statutory consultee was satisfied on that point. Just about your point about photographs, I take your point about photographs. Yeah, the only thing I say is, I think if you go any month, it's always going to look slightly different no matter what time you do. So, but yes, more recent photos probably would have been not unhelpful.
Thank you. Again, I must admit, from my point of view, in terms of the conditions, I think we have had raised by a number of people the issue about dust not only affecting the residential properties and how it impacts the highway. So I think certainly my own feeling would be the looking at the condition for a in effect a dust management plan rather than the wording we've currently got would make sense, because then we can take that into account and make sure that's agreed between obviously the council and the applicants as well as to how that could operate. I've got Councillor Hendry and then I've got Councillor Riches and then Councillor Scott.
Thank you, Chair. I don't actually have too much to say about this. No, I don't. Can I speak?
Please do, Alistair.
Okay. I've read through the paperwork, looked through it all. There is no big deal to actually stop this and refuse permission. Not really, not at all. Once you read between the lines, the dust issue, you can get dust issues from any industrial place up and down the country. It makes not a jot of difference. However, if a condition has to be put in place for dust management, then that's absolutely fine. It's not a deal breaker. Generally speaking, I wouldn't have thought the water factor, the runoff, is actually something that is such a big deal either. That can be managed too. On the back of that, Mr. Chairman, I would like to propose we grant permission. Thank you.
And again, just to confirm, that's with the replacement dust management condition.
Absolutely.
Okay. Councillor Riches.
Thank you. Would a dust management strategy include monitoring and site regular, you know, as with a quarry where they have monitoring equipment and then there are regular visits by the appropriate authority?
Mr. Titchener or Mrs. De Vries.
I think it depends on the wording of the condition, which we haven't written yet. I think the difficulty is with, if we had a dust management condition, that would require details of how they're going to manage, what they're going to manage on site. If we get complaints, we can then proactively react to any complaints we receive in terms of monitoring and management. What I can't promise, particularly given where we are in sort of transitioning to a new authority, is that we have any resources to proactively manage and monitor on a sort of more regular basis, not knowing what the situation is for the new authority. But the submission of the condition would require details. It would require approval of the details. And then in the event we get a complaint, we can go back to the details and say, what's happening on site? Why is this not being complied with? As we do now with enforcement monitoring. But I think we would need to discuss the wording and agree the wording with environmental health, because it would be sort of ourselves and environmental health in terms of looking at managing and monitoring that situation going forward.
Richard.
So, as this is an activity that's already started, we can't condition it that it can't start until that's been agreed. So this seems to be a bit of a difficult, I find myself in a very difficult situation here of voting for something that clearly needs this dust management scheme. There's no point having a scheme if it's not monitored or can't be raised by local residents who wish an investigation. So I can't quite see what I'm going to vote for.
And without putting words into Mr. De Vries' mouth, I believe what was being said was, in effect, there won't be proactive monitoring in terms of people out there randomly taking samples, but there would be the ability through enforcement, both environmental health and planning. If there were complaints from residents that there are issues with dust, then they can then be responded to in the same way we would with noise complaints.
Yeah, and I think in terms of timing, appreciate we can't say before the use first commences, because obviously the use is in commencement at the moment on site. But what we could do is trigger it to a timing requirement. So we could say within 1 month of the date of consent, a management plan should be submitted to and agreed and thereafter complied with. So we can trigger it that way in terms of a time. But obviously it won't be prior to the use commencing. And as Mr. Stitch has already pointed out, there are some other unresolved issues on site. So we would be working very keenly with the applicant to try and get to the bottom of those unresolved issues.
I've got a number of members who've indicated, so if I can let you know the order in which they indicated: Councillor Scott, Councillor Murphy, Councillor Kingham, Councillor Bolt. Councillor Bolt's dropped off. So, Councillor Scott, would you like to go first?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, dust was problem that I was going to raise. And I guess it could be resolved really easily, even by providing nets. I think if it not only dust, it was dust. I think somebody mentioned that there was wind-blown debris was actually going across the road. So to actually stop that, could you just confirm if this is just for storage, or is the mixing of this, does that happen on this site as well? And also, is there any restrictions on the hours of operation? Because again, early transport movements might cause concern.
So in terms of its storage and blending, so that's what would be the approvals for. I mean, I saw a machine on site when I drove past this morning, so there's some level of processing that takes place, and that's part and parcel of what they're after. There aren't proposed to be controls in terms of hours of operation, partly because environmental health were consulted and are satisfied. And I think that's because of the distance that it isn't from nearby properties. And I think they said it's 400 metres to the nearest one and a kilometre to the boundary of Western Zoyland. And they, when I spoke to them, didn't have a record of complaints from the site. So we didn't feel that such a condition was justified in this particular instance, which is why we haven't proposed to put one on the permission.
Thank you, Councillor Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. I was just listening to Councillor Betty when he raised this question of aircraft, which kind of alerted me to think. I remember in that area there was quite a prolific amount of microlight flying and a microlight training centre, and dust is not really compatible with exposed engines that are on this type of aircraft. And I just wondered if it's just a question to the officer, because he didn't really mention anything about aircraft until, and Mr. Betty mentioned aircraft across the other way. And I would have thought that a management plan would need to look at that. And I assume there's been no complaints from the people that operate in that area, but that doesn't mean to say it shouldn't be included in a management plan. Is there anything that the officer can give me comfort about? Because, dust and aircraft just don't mix.
Mr. Titchener.
I'm not sure how we answer that, to be perfectly honest. I mean, other than we have to go on the information that we've got, which is that they haven't, it's been operating there, for at least 18 months, and there isn't a history of complaints. They haven't raised an objection to the planning application, and environmental health is satisfied. There is some separation from the airfield because as I said, the operational parts of the airfield are much further west from the actual site, so they're not immediately adjoining the site. There's quite some separation distance, and the site is actually downwind of the prevailing winds of the site as well, being at the eastern side outside of the site. Not saying that wouldn't always affect it. So we just have to go on the information we've got, and that's where we've got to where we are with it.
And I guess to some extent, the dust management plan is going to be saying how they control the dust. So if it's controlling it for dealing with the highways, I mean, one of the concerns I think I had was the conditions we previously had were dealing with quite distant receptors in terms of dust, whereas if we're dealing with something in terms of just dust management, then that will cover it for highways and aircraft and microlights. Okay, I've got Councillor Kingham and then Councillor Pearce. Councillor Kingham.
Thank you, Chairman. Can't completely agree with Councillor Henry. This dust is stored in the open air, and I'm not surprised that people of Western Zoyland not getting the dust. They probably are, but don't realise exactly where it's coming from. And I'm afraid I wouldn't be able to support this application.
Thank you. Councillor Pearce.
When the debate, the consultation process has thrown up no concerns of, well, the town council obviously, but not from the nearby operator of the airfield. With the dust management plan, I'm happy to second Councillor Hendry's proposal.
Thank you very much. I'm not seeing any other comments or questions from members, so we have the recommendation to grant permission with the amendment of the conditions that are currently there to cover the dust management plan. So that's conditions 3 and 4 in effect are being covered and will be amended to cover that. Those in favour of granting permission on that basis, please show. And those against, please show. And that's the full 12. Yep, so that is clearly carried. So permission is granted with the amended conditions. So thank you very much. Right, members, if you could turn back in your papers to page 52, where we have an application without a member of the public present to speak. And we move to Cheddar, but we stay with Mr. Titchener. Carry on.
So so this is application. It's for the erection of a detached annex and for the erection of a single-storey rear extension. So that's on the site of an existing rear extension, which is to be demolished. It's at a property called Regina, which is at Round Oak Road in Cheddar. So it's before members due to the objection of Cheddar Parish Council. So this is the red line just showing the existing properties. It's a detached property with a reasonably large rear garden. And then in a central location, it's finished with render and brick with UPVC windows and a tiled roof. So this plan shows the parts of two elements of the proposals. Well, this is the existing plans. You can see it's large garden. It's got this existing sort of rear extension and side extension as shown here. So that's as at present. And then the proposal is for the side and rear elements to be demolished, and then this single-storey flat-roofed extension to be added to the back. And then towards the bottom end of the garden is this detached annex is to be provided, which is a two-bedroom annex. So the extension would be constructed of matching materials to blend in with the dwelling. The annex is also going to be sort of constructed of similar pallets. So that's render, brick plinth, UPVC windows, and tiled doors and windows. In terms of the paris's concerns that relate to the annex, so the paris's concerns relate to the annex. They haven't raised any concerns about the extension per se. Their concerns are about sort of the size, scale, and massing, and whether it's an appropriate design relative to the dwelling. So the parish were consulted 3 times on the scheme because some amendments were sought. So the parish have chosen to reiterate their concerns. Most recently, they consider it to be a tandem development and not subservient to the main property, and that no additional parking is provided. So in terms of what amendments were secured, so some small changes have been made. It was originally to be a 2-storey annex, as shown in the sort of the top half of the slide. So with accommodation in the loft and positioned along the full length of the rear boundary with the neighbouring property. So that's been changed. It's kind of been turned on its side. It's now single story. There are roof lights, but they are just serving the ground floor accommodation for additional light rather than there be any accommodation in the loft space. The proposal remains slightly larger than perhaps might be considered ideal for a detached annex. Some further options were explored by officers regarding the size and scale and positioning of the unit. The applicant's intended use is that it's to be for the applicant's disabled son in future years. Disability is a protected characteristic under the Equality Act and something under the public sector equality duty we need to be mindful of. And the provision of dedicated accommodation for their son, whilst not determinative alone, must be afforded some way in moving the application forward. We sort of accept that some of the parish is concerned about being, we note that they talk about it being a separate dwelling. Ultimately, if they want to use it as a separate dwelling, that needs planning permission in its own right. So there are controls there. What we've tried to do is just trying to limit the overall height a little bit, as much as the applicant was, willing to put forward ultimately. But we've taken the view that it's still an acceptable development in an acceptable location, and the impacts have been minimised. And take into account the circumstances, that plays a small bit of weight in the overall balance. So we think that tips in favour of granting consent. And just some photographs just to show the existing. You can see in terms of this is the rear of the existing property is all quite tired and very much in need of modernisation. Which the development will facilitate, and all this development down the side, this all gets removed, and then at the back you can see the boundary with the neighbouring properties. There is going to be, in our view, it's sufficient separation, and now particularly given it's single storey. We note that some concern had been expressed by a property Arlington House here about amenity impacts, but there's quite an offset distance between them here and where the proposal is going to be located, so at least 25 metres, and it's single storey, so that we wouldn't consider that there would be unacceptable impacts on the amenity of the occupants of Arlington House, notwithstanding that's quite a bit of intervening vegetation. And then just on to parking issues. So this plan here shows the layout as existing, so there's a bit of parking to the fore. And the parish were concerned about parking provision, but in our view, there's likely to be more parking provision at the end than there is at the start, because they're getting rid of the small single-storey thing down the side and providing parking spaces there, in addition to what they've currently got to the side and to the front. And overall, the parking complies with county parking standards, so we wouldn't consider there to actually be an issue. And just lastly, the county ecologists had reviewed some submitted surveys, made some recommendations about species to control works and controls on lighting enhancements. They're all addressed, they're proposed as condition. So I just, there's one additional objection which is coming very late, so I'll just try and summarise sort of the points. It says the annex is designed as a 2-bed, 4-person dwelling, should be treated as such. The application form indicates that trees and hedges are not affected. However, it's clear that a tree is located within influence of the annex. Any further removal will create a further erosion of a natural edge to the boundary. The annex is creating backland development contrary to good urban planning. It does not have direct access to the highway, must meet parking standards. It's been placed against the southern boundary, therefore providing line of sight to my rear garden and neighbouring properties. Prior to the application, a tree in the garden had been removed. The annex has been provided with roof windows which may enable the creation of an upper floor. They're not required. If the space was converted to accommodation and PD rights, a resident would be looking to my garden and neighbouring properties. I also like to state, when purchasing the property, one of the features was the enclosed stone wall with a southern boundary being a view of trees, so there's not now having the possibility of that view being obscured. I don't know, reading those comments, whether they seem to be sort of commenting potentially, I don't want to say for definite, on the scheme before it was amended, because they talk about it being along the full length and of a height to accommodate first floor accommodation, and as hopefully members can see from the plans, that the roof has been sort of significantly brought down and the property brought off the boundary so as not to be, so there isn't 2-storey accommodation. Therefore, the possibility of there being intervisibility between that and another property has pretty much been removed from the scheme. In terms of the tandem aspect of it being backland development, I mean, we're not talking about a dwelling in its own right here. We're talking about an ancillary building in someone's garden, like you. It's a relatively large ancillary building, but still an ancillary building. I think there is a wording in the Cheddar neighbourhood plan about not allowing tandem developments, but they're talking about new dwellings in people's back gardens. I think we also need to be mindful of that permitted development rights allow people to erect buildings in their rear gardens for ancillary purposes up to a certain size. So the principle of people putting a building in their back garden is okay. This one probably won't meet PD rights just because it's slightly bigger, but you could still put a building, and I don't think that particular part of Cheddar Parish Council would apply. Parish Council's neighbourhood plan would apply here. So overall, not taking account of the various considerations on this, we don't consider that there are any matters that can't be addressed by conditions, and our recommendation therefore is to grant consent.
Thank you very much. If I could just ask one question. You mentioned in your presentation that were this to want to become a separate dwelling, it would need to have a planning application. On previous ones where we've had annexes, we've often had this building should only be used as ancillary to the dwelling. I may have missed it, but I don't think that's within the conditions. So is that something we could have as a condition on there?
So we tend to put it on depending on how the application has come forward, because if it's come forward as a householder application, you can't effectively subdivide it. There's no harm if members want to add it as a condition. There's a kind of belt and braces approach. It's always going to need planning permission if they want to do it, but there's no reason not to if members still want to.
Thank you very much. Any Councillor Bolt and then Councillor Kingham.
Just hopefully a quick question. It's you're saying it's an ancillary building. Will that have all the normal permitted development rights if they wanted to go up into the loft or anything like that, or is that automatically removed because it's an ancillary building?
Because it's bigger than you could do under permitted development rights, they won't be able to make it any higher under permitted development rights, for example. So they would always need a planning application to do that in the circumstances. So yes, they're not able, effectively, in terms of if your concern is can they go and make it bigger or go into the loft without a planning application? No, they couldn't.
Could I also just follow up on that in terms of from what I think was in the report, the amended plan, the ridge line has been dropped pretty low. So in terms of going up into the loft with what's there at the moment, there isn't one.
Yeah, I mean, this plan shows it here. You can see there's no standing room there. You know, you would have to do wholesale replacement of the roof, and you can't do that without a planning application.
Thank you. Councillor Kingham.
Thank you, Chairman. On the site plan, it shows a tree in the middle of the plot. Is that the one they've cut down?
No, that's looks like a tree, but it's actually located in the septic tank.
Is that what it is?
Yes. So
that's the water feature. So
it looks certainly like a tree to me. I'd like to move the recommendations with that septic tank in the middle.
Okay, is that second, Councillor Henry? So I'm just being asked, is that with the additional condition in terms of it's in use of ancillary use with the main dwelling? Okay, Councillor Henry, you're seconding that? Any other comments? Yes, Councillor Riches. So it was Councillor Henry seconded, Councillor Kingham proposed, and Councillor Riches speaking.
Sorry, just a quick one on the reference from Cheddar Parish Council to being a tandem development. As it is laid out now, would it be possible to drive a vehicle down the side of the house to get to the annex? So you could be effectively using it as a tandem development.
So I think that the space they are going to create down the side of the dwelling is clearly big enough to get a car because they're showing parking spaces in it. So potentially, yes, you could get a car down there, but you would still need planning permission if you wanted to use it as a separate dwelling in future. If that's what the concern is, if the concern is you can get a car down there and therefore they might turn it into an independent dwelling at some point in future. Well, to do that, they would need an application.
Okay. Would you have any concern of when it's being used for the disabled person and their carer, of somebody driving a car down so that the disabled person could come out of the door into a car and then drive back through the garden? Is that any issue? I'm just wondering if there should be a condition on that.
I mean, the site is all going to be managed by the same family unit, so like they will manage it in the most appropriate way for their son, and giving him the best care. I guess in that sense, we will. I'm not sure how we would condition it, and I guess we would just accept that they will, they will provide the best care, for him and what's most appropriate in terms of how they use the site.
Okay. Councillor Scott.
Chairman, I'm not sure whether this should be added as a condition about the ecology, because the ecologist says that if protected species are found, they should have the correct procedures in place.
I think
so. As an informative, whether that should be added as a condition.
I think there are a number of ecological conditions on there, but is that covered? So about 58, 57, 58 is the conditions, and 59. Bulk of which are ecological conditions.
You've got
Already.
condition 3. recommencement. So.
So just to clarify, so there are conditions sort of 3 onwards on the report are all to do with ecology. So some of them, the first one to do with the protection of ecology during works, and then to do with provision of bat roosting provision, and there's a condition about protection of lighting, and there's a condition about provision of enhancement. So we probably think that the ecology issues have all been wrapped up in the various conditions proposed as part on the application already.
Okay. If there's no further comments or questions, we've had the recommendation to grant permission subject to the additional condition about the linking of the 2 properties. All those in favour, please show. And that's unanimous. Clearly carried. Thank you very much, members. That brings us to the end of the applications today. In fact, the end of the applications forever. So we'll move to for this committee. So we haven't finished the meeting yet. So we've got Mrs. DeVries. You've got the reports, which are somewhere at the back of the report. So pages 85, agenda item 7.1, which is certificates of lawfulness.
Thank you. Right, so we've got certificate of lawfulness for existing uses. We've granted planning permission at Cheddar Concrete Products, Warrens Hill, Cheddar, for certificate of lawfulness for an existing extension and use of a twin unit cabin as a dwelling and use of the garden, and existing use of land and building for equestrian uses. We've also granted a lawful development certificate for existing use of land and buildings for mixed use, comprising manufacturing, storage of concrete products, and also the use of land and shipping container for the storage of tools and equipment associated with landscape gardening for the same site. There was a lawful development certificate refused for certificate of lawfulness for existing use of field and outbuildings for domestic use at the Jays Field and Outbuilding, Lippiat Lane in Cheddar. And a certificate of lawfulness granted planning permission for mixed use of existing dwelling to include 2 holiday apartments and 2 bedrooms used for B&B. That was granted planning permission or lawful development certificate.
Questions on those? So if we move to 7.2,
In
appeals.
terms of appeals received, we've got an appeal for erection of a 4-storey building containing 8 flats to the rear of 2728 Cornhill, Bridgewater. This application has previously been before members. I think what changed is that solar panels got put on the neighbouring building, so it became a material issue in terms of overshadowing, so it was refused by officers. But that's in for appeal. We've got installation of an illuminated digital poster and an appeal against a determination for prior approval for excavation works within an agricultural unit at Cannington Enterprise. They put in another agricultural prior approval for a second silage clamp that was refused because we considered it to be in connection with a commercial operation rather than agriculture. But that's a area of debate between officers and the agent at the minute.
Okay, I'm not seeing any questions on those. So 7.3, which is appeals decided.
Appeals decided. We had One Walnut Drive, which was a application for a fence, which we refused planning permission and has been dismissed by the inspector.
Yeah, and finally 7.4, enforcement appeals.
We have received, but these are just yours, sighting of caravans and lorry body on a trailer at land at Kingston Farm, and use of land for non-agricultural purposes, including the sighting of shipping containers, storage of vehicles, domestic paraphernalia, waste, building materials, rubble, plant, and use of land for non-residential purposes, and dismantling and storage of vehicles. So those 2 both had notices served on them recently, and we've been rewarded with every single enforcement notice we've served by an application for appeal. So we've got 3 enforcement appeals that are in with us at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Any comments or questions on that? If not, just before we finish the committee, while I've still got control of the mic.
Had a good
Oh, you're going to
news.
say on Cricketers Farm? I haven't got control of the mic. We'll hand back to Dawn.
Right, so this was just because I thought we would like to go out on a big happy story and how lovely we are and how much faith we have in each other. It was about Cricketers Farm because obviously it was before members a little while ago to remove the affordable housing obligations, and we were sort of telling you about a deal to try and save the affordable housing in the background that's outside the planning process, so you can't really consider it, but you know, have faith in us, we're working on it. So the application was for 109 dwellings. Just got to find the original slideshow. Everyone else makes it look so easy when they do this. Right, so planning history. So the original consent was 2019, granted consent in October 2020, secured 15% affordable housing through 106. That's 16 dwellings was secured by 106. Then a really, really sticky conversation came to you guys for 2022, where they raised viability. We changed and worked with the scheme as much as we could to reduce what we could, but it did ultimately present removal of all the affordable housing that was before you guys as members for determination. So we, as a committee, did grant consent after quite a long debate in October last year, accepting 0% affordable housing, but the review clawback as is in these type of applications. So what happened next? Following grant of consent, there was an application submitted to Homes England, which the housing team worked quite collaboratively with Strongbox and the Parish Council to make sure that the 16 dwellings were still delivered, albeit outside of the 106. So a successful bid was submitted and was received for 1.5 million, which is a non-refundable grant. So that's gone to the delivery of these houses. This was used in addition to a recoverable loan from Sedgemoor. So Sedgemoor put some money into it, which they would get back over a 30-year period, and some EDF mitigation funding as well. So Homes in Sedgemoor, on behalf of Somerset District Council, currently entering into contract with Strongbox. So they're going to be purchasing the dwellings. So they'll be owned by Homes in Sedgemoor, and the development contract sign up is close. So originally, by taking on the site, the housing team were looking to provide affordable rent, which basically means you can rent the dwelling for 80% of what you would be able to rent the dwelling at market prices. So affordable rent is 80% or less of market value. Because of the Homes England grant that went into it, they've been able to reduce it to social rent, which means you pay less than 50% market rent to be able to rent it. So it makes those 16 units a lot more affordable than just affordable. So it's actually a really, really positive news story. The time frame is also set out on this slide in terms of delivery. So the first date, so October 2022, is when Homes in Sedgemoor become the owner of the relevant plots. And then the PC figure is called practical completion. So that's the point where we think they're going to be ready for occupation. So the first few plots are due to come online sort of June 2023. And then we've got some further plots for September this year, and then September 2024, when we would have had all the units online. And it has also resulted in some positive press. We get quite a lot of fairly negative press in planning, but there was quite positive press in terms of the outcome and what that's meant for affordable people. So I thought it's a good news story, and you know, it does actually show the outcome of some of the difficult decisions we do have to be on the hairy end for, but it was a really positive outcome. And just while I've got the mic, I wanted to say thank you very much for being an amazing committee, because I have really enjoyed sort of having some really interesting arguments with some of you, and you know, going through all the details, but it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Obviously today is the final planning committee of Sedgemoor District Council. It feels like a bit of an end of an era. For myself, I think I've sat on this committee for the best part of now the last 24 years, with a very short interlude when I was on the executive, and 14 of those, the last 14 as chair, or chairman, I should say. Otherwise, I shall upset myself. When I started, this committee was meeting in the old council chamber, which was above where development management are now. Almost all the applications came before us, and the afternoon tended to be a could you keep up with the page turning in terms of permissions or not. Technology's moved on. When I started, we had some very young, enthusiastic planning officers who used to attend putting acetates on overhead projectors, trying to keep up with the presentation, and one of them sat at the end of the table with us today. We had no public speaking time at all, so they weren't involved at that stage. But I think it's worth looking back sometimes, because things have changed over time. They're changing again. But I think the beauty of Sedgemoor is we've managed to keep the best that we've had and learn from the rest, so that we can then move on and improve what we do. In terms of personnel, we've had an awful lot of head and lead chief planning officers and those attending this committee. Again, when I kicked off, it was John Conder used to sit at the top of the table, and I must admit I was terrified of John Conder. But then we had Baz Juniper, we then moved to Joe Fryer, Steve Atkinson came, Christine Miles, who again, I think filled many members with trepidation, who didn't argue with Christine Miles, Claire Pearce, Mr. Howlett, and then now with Dawn. So it's been a good team. Our legal team who's with us today, again, we've got Dawn Lehman, but prior to Dawn, many of you may remember Suzanne Nesbitt and Dorothy O'Farrell, who used to be with us for many meetings. Committee managers, I've had Christine Greenway when I first started, and Layla has been with us for a number of years now. And in terms of members, I was lucky enough to serve on this committee as David Busby, some of you may remember, John Lang, Duncan McGinty, David Jocelyn, who all were people that you could learn from. And I've had some terrific vice chairmans for a period, David Jocelyn. Some of you may remember Dennis Davey, and then Tony recently. Thank you very much, Tony, for your support. And portfolios, we've had Andrew Gilling, we've had Mike Caswell, and now Jill. So thank you very much for your time. I think it's just, from my point of view, the committee's only ever as good as its members. And I've been very lucky to have some excellent councillors on here. It's an interesting committee in that it's one that some people don't want to touch with a barge pole. You're very high profile. There isn't anywhere to hide, but you make decisions that make real differences to people's lives. And I think that's something we've always taken on board, whether it's large housing developments or individual units. It's the most important thing to those people whose application it is. So it's not always an easy committee, and we've made decisions sometimes that have been more difficult than others. As I say, there's a range. We've had occasions where in this committee we've been talking about up to 1,000 houses, and when that's resolved, we've moved on to a barn in the middle of a field, almost in the middle of nowhere. And it's that contrast that I think makes it so fascinating. As I said, I'd like to thank all the members who are here, all the staff who I've worked with. It's been a fantastic time to be chairman and a member of this committee. I will embarrass just a couple of long-suffering officers. Sat to my right, Layla has put up with my nagging over many, many years. I don't know how many site visits you've organised. We've had, and the watering holes that had to go with them a few years ago. We've had a lot of study tours. And I think Layla's practice of running guide groups has been extremely helpful in herding members around site visits and hopefully keeping members of the public in a position where they know what's going on, but not causing us problems in terms of interest and declarations that members have to do. And at the far end on my left, Stuart. Just want to say thank you ever so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure working with you over the years. When Stuart came into his previous job, the performance of Sedgemoor as a planning authority was not as at the best. We were not, as we are now, ranked top in the country, and so an awful lot of work went into that. Watching Stuart work has been a pleasure. It's been interesting to see in the aspects that we've both worked with parish councils, we've worked with agents. And again, when Stuart came in, the relationships with those weren't always at the best, and you've made a tremendous difference to the development of this council, and your mark is definitely made in this area, Stuart. So thank you ever so much. Finally, I will not say any much more because I'm coming between the committee and lunch, and I know that is a dangerous position to be in. So as I say, thank you all so much, and for the last time, I will close the meeting. Thank you.